A year or so ago, when I was 19, I was home alone and my dogs were in the backyard. I was on spring break. My younger brother was at his high school. Both of my parents and my uncle that lives with us were working. It was like early afternoon, 12 p.m. when I woke up and went to make my breakfast and stuff. I was watching a YouTube video while eating my scrambled eggs. I don't remember what the video I was watching was about, but I finished eating and went to sit on the couch for like 10 minutes, and then I had the sudden urge to go to the bathroom. I stood up and took my phone with me and started watching another video. Closed the door, started doing my business, and at the same time my phone was at max volume. Then, all of a sudden, clear as day, I heard a woman hum outside the door. It sounded like a lullaby. Once again, clear as day, I heard it. It lasted for like 5 to 7 seconds, and I was dumbfounded. I always believed in spirits, ghosts, etc., but I thought logically at first that it could have been the video I was watching. So I rewound it to make sure. But no, that hum did not come from my video. Then I thought it must have been my mom coming home from work early because she does that sometimes. So I called out to her. I stood up, didn't even finish doing my business, opened the door and called out again to my mom, with no answer. I sat back down. I replayed the video a couple more times and once again made sure that that sound did not come from any video or any noise on my phone. So I finished up, flushed, left the bathroom, and looked around the house, checking to see if my mom had arrived and just didn't hear me calling. But she wasn't home. I checked on my 3 dogs, and they were just laying there like nothing had happened. Then I called my mom on the phone and told her what had occurred. She also believes in spirits and said not to worry. I told my brother, and all he said was, "Bruh." Then I told my dad, who is also a believer of spirits, but he takes a more logical view. Like, he makes sure that nothing natural could have caused it, before telling me if the spirit comes back to tell them to go away and ask for the lottery number. I don't remember when this occurred, but I'm pretty sure I was still 19 when it happened. But one night, I was going to bed. Me and my brother share a room. He's been asleep for a while, and I think it was around 1 a.m. You know, that stage when you're about to fall into deep sleep, but you're still aware of your surroundings. Like you can hear things as if you were awake. So right before I fell into that deep sleep, once again clear as day, I heard the same woman's voice. It wasn't my mother's voice, but this time I heard the voice right next to my ear. It was whispering something to me, but I don't recall what it said. But it was perfectly clear, and it was right next to my ear. I instantly woke up and opened my eyes, but there was no one there. I stayed awake probably for another 30 minutes under my sheets before falling back to sleep. I told my brother and my parents the next day of what I had heard, and my mom said that she would see what she could do. Legit, that was the last time that I heard the spirit. So to this day, I'm trying to remember what the spirit whispered. But I just don't know. I don't know if I had sleep paralysis, but this happened almost a year ago. I was sleeping, and then all of a sudden I heard loud bangs. I don't know if it was gunshots or fireworks. I just know it caught me off guard. And then all of a sudden I felt something hit my spine. I couldn't move my legs or arms. I was sleeping on my right side facing my wall next to the window. I kept my eyes closed and I tried moving, fighting whatever was holding me down. Tried kicking. I didn't yell even though I was about to scream so that my parents could come. But then I started to feel my legs again and kept kicking until I had full control back. I kept my eyes closed and fell asleep. I woke up in the morning, wanting to check and make sure that I didn't catch a bullet. But that only happened to me once. This happened about a year ago in a park near my house. My brother and I are very spiritual and believe strongly in this type of stuff. I had this one Ouija board for a few years now, gifted to me by my old stepdad. We decided to use it one night and got in contact with a ghost. It went pretty well, and we did it again a week later. We talked to a new ghost, and the ghost from the first time. It was pretty cool and insane to experience something so real. They were very nice, and we were very respectful since we take this stuff seriously. Toward the end, we asked that they would not follow us home and that they would let us leave. They agreed, and we said goodbye. They moved the planchette, therefore they said goodbye with us. It seemed to be all going normal when we left, until my brother started noticing a weird feeling in our home, and on top of that, he said that one day he was hanging out in the living room and felt something in the room with him. It was on the couch where he was sitting, and he could see a cabinet door that he left open in the kitchen. He asked out loud that if someone was there to please close that cabinet door. And they did. After I got home, he told me this, and we busted out the board again. I know that you shouldn't use the board in your home, but I felt like we needed to know what was going on. We asked if the ghost who was in our home was the ghost from the park. The planchette moved to yes. Fast forward a year today, and we still live in the same house. We have a few experiences with ghosts and spirits in our home, but never the one from the park. Plus, I never go to the park anymore. My question to you guys is what made this follow us home? We did everything we were supposed to do, had a very friendly encounter, and they moved the planchette to say goodbye. I read that that's usually all that you need to do, but we did all that, and it still didn't work. I don't believe that the ghost was negative or evil, considering that they just left our home after a while. Or at least I think, since I don't feel them here anymore. My brother is convinced that the ghost was messing with us, since during the conversation when we asked their religion, they just muttered out a bunch of nonsense. I guess that could be it, but I'm wondering if there could be another reason that they followed us home. When I was around 15 or so, my mom and stepfather got divorced in a pretty dramatic way. It's like the whole household was just turned upside down. Everyone's routines were off. Mom was out doing something most nights after work. My little sister spent more time with her friends. And I became something of a night owl, usually waiting until the wee morning hours to lie down. Our house was a simple one in a rural area. 2 stories, with a huge backyard sharing a fence with a cow pasture and the entrance to some thick woods. The house had a lot of problems, but I enjoyed taking over the maintenance and gardening work as they gave me something to do when I was feeling depressed. For some perspective, our kitchen windows looked out directly to the fence described above. The left half of the fence bordered one of the back corners of the big cow pasture, while the right half bordered the entrance to the woods, which had a rather overgrown trailhead just barely visible from the kitchen window. For the most part, though, all you could see was overgrown grass and shrubbery, at least 4 or 5 feet high, and some low-hanging trees of mixed oak and cedar. This backdrop added a sort of eerie tranquility to our property, which I appreciated from the first day we moved in. One night, I took a break from my homework after realizing I had stayed up way too late on a Thursday, even for my standards. I went downstairs to make some food, and my dog followed me like she always did. I made a grilled cheese, and while I was at the sink cleaning the pan, I noticed some of the grass from the wood line start to shuffle around. It startled me at first, but as soon as I began to fixate on it, I saw no more disturbance. We lived in wildlife country at the time, so I figured it was probably a deer, coyote, or a cougar. Unsurprising for the latter, given that the farmer who owned the pasture had dozens of cows and sometimes didn't bring them in at night. Strangely, though, I noticed this for several more nights, always when I was doing the dishes after eating. I would look out the window, see the grass shuffle around, then see nothing further when I fixated on the spot. I was always a fan of scary movies, and I tended to be a jumpy kid, so each time I convinced myself I wasn't really seeing any sort of pattern. This changed, though, when my dog would start fixating on the woods herself and barking at night. Furthermore, our motion sensor security light would begin to stay activated sometimes for hours on end, only switching off when I would get to the kitchen to make my midnight snacks. Eventually, I told my mom about all this, and while she initially seemed concerned, she pointed out that we did live behind the woods after all, and so we should expect animals or occasional homeless squatters near our property. She said that if I was concerned, I could always call the police or animal control. I didn't disagree, and for the most part gave the matter no further thought. One night, though, I decided that a 1 a.m. dip in our hot tub in the backyard sounded good. I changed, and my dog and I went outside. I climbed in, closed my eyes, and zoned out like usual. I was whipped awake when I heard a loud crunch, followed by what sounded like someone falling over into some bushes. I stood up, turned around, and shouted, "Who's there?" But no one replied. It was dead silent, and I had the creeps. I put my robe on and went inside. The next day I told my neighbor friend and crush about this, and she thought I was being ridiculous, but nonetheless agreed to go with me to check out that part of the woods to see if there was any evidence of anyone or anything hiding in the direction that I had heard the noise coming from. We stomped through the woods until we got to where we could see the back of my house. We checked every shrub and every blackberry bush, but found nothing. It was probably a coyote or something deciding on whether or not you'd make a good dinner, the neighbor girl said, snarking. I playfully flipped her off, then laughed, quietly relieved that there was no creepy person stalking me the previous night. Well, of course, I might have been wrong about that. Because that night, when I was making my usual sandwich, our security light came on, and I raced to the back door to see what was up. I saw what I could barely make out to be a shadowy, 6-foot-tall or so figure disappear from the trail and into the brush to the right of it. My heart skipped a beat, and my dog, probably sensing my nerves, began barking wildly. I opened the door and shouted, "The fuck's out there? Come out!" Of course, there was nothing but silence. After sitting in the dining room for an hour, I figured that I was being paranoid and seeing what I was subconsciously afraid of being out there. I called my neighbor back, and she, surprisingly, did not call me crazy, and told me she would tell her dad about it in the morning. I never saw this sort of thing again, and my neighbor's dad chalked it up to being a homeless person camping out in the woods. Or, at the very most, a stalker from one of the houses around ours. Something he explained wouldn't be surprising as my sister was quite a looker, and he thought it made sense that she would have a stalker, as if this was supposed to make me feel better. Well, I suppose it did in the end, as months passed and I forgot about it fairly quickly. That is, until a local news bulletin came out about a sexual predator having been recently apprehended by local police, after a report from a couple living a few houses down from us was filed about the wife being approached by the tall and gaunt man in the evening hours as she was watering her garden boxes. She said he suddenly appeared, quietly as if he were trying to sneak up on her. When she noticed him, she demanded his name, but he darted back into the woods. She called the sheriff immediately, and half an hour or so later the department combed through the woods and apprehended the man, who was hiding under a fallen tree. All the report said was that the man claimed he was living in the woods for months, surviving on snacks from a nearby gas station, and would not give a reason for why he was out there. However, he was apparently wanted for numerous sexual offenses on minors and vulnerable adults some years prior, whatever those ended up being. Now, years later, I still get uncomfortable looking into the woods at night, anywhere I live. Who can blame me? When I was in middle school and high school, my buddies and I were obsessed with studying the paranormal. I had every book on ghost lore that there was, and I had read them cover to cover. We would build websites with our favorite stories and local folk legends. We eventually began doing films and video expeditions at night to houses, cemeteries, caves, etc. in the surrounding area. This is just a short collection of a few of the more eerie and fun things that happened. It started off with my dad driving us out to these places at night. We would tramp off into a field or cemetery while he stayed in the car and smoked a cigarette. I remember one night we walked up a hill into a graveyard and immediately heard howling coming from the area to our right. 2 of the 4 of us freaked out and immediately headed back to the car. My buddy and I recognized it as a pack of coyotes and decided that they were more afraid of us than we were of them. There was still something that caught his eye, and from our left, behind us at this point as we were distracted by the coyotes. He tore out before I had a chance to see what it was, and I was too slow to realize that I was standing alone in the middle of a graveyard in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. When I turned around to see what the commotion was, I saw something that wasn't terrifying so much as befuddling. I heard the quick scamper of something relatively heavy running through the forest on the edge of the graveyard roughly 20 feet away. I shined my flashlight on it thinking that it was a deer, and I could see instantly that it was not. It was nothing. Not nothing as in there was nothing there. Nothing, as in I could clearly see it kicking up leaves and hear the noise and even feel the vibration as it ran. But it was as if someone invisible were running through the forest not 5 yards away from me. I turned around and walked back to the car at that point, and haven't been back since. Later, when I got my license, I would drive us out on our own. One of our first treks was to the big house on my 16th birthday. We had to walk through about a mile of cow pasture to get there, but it was worth it. This was a classic haunted house with twisted stairways and decrepit fireplaces and a spooky attic. We had entirely too many people with us at that point, so it eventually devolved into me telling my best scary stories to guys laughing nervously and girls shrieking. We left after maybe an hour of exploring with nothing but some pictures of orbs and stuff to take back. My buddy the ghost hunter and I hung back when everyone else had left, walking a few yards behind. I suddenly got the feeling that we had left someone and did a quick head count of those in front. Nobody was missing. I looked behind at the house on top of the hill and saw a candlelight flitting from window to window in the attic. We sped our steps up a bit and caught up to the group without looking back again. To get to the big house, you have to go through a cemetery where a moderately famous Confederate officer was buried by the name of Champ Ferguson. My buddy and I decided to go back to this cemetery due to the violent nature of his death. He was hanged for treason in Nashville, and do some looking around. We took our flashlights and our camcorder. You have to park at the bottom of a small hill and climb some stairs to get into the small cemetery, and we made our way back into the very back where the officer's tomb was. I had my night vision on in my camcorder, and the screen flipped out, so I was using that to guide me through the otherwise completely dark graveyard. My friend had a flashlight that he was using, and I had mine in my pocket. We always checked the batteries to make sure that everything was working well before we left on these excursions. As I knelt down beside the headstone and was reading, the light from my friend's flashlight went out. I asked him to point it back in my direction to illuminate the faded text, and he said that he couldn't. It had died. I gave him mine, and he tried it, to no avail. Suddenly, the camcorder went out as well. We were in the middle of the dark with no one around for miles. We did relatively well staying calm. We had to grope our way around the tombs to get back to the road, all the while with the intense feeling of being watched from multiple sides. I almost broke my ankle when I got back to the small retainer wall and forgot about the steps in my hurry to get back into the safety of the car. This happened about 7 years ago and still creeps me out. My husband and I were living in this little above-garage apartment that only had like 4 little rooms. It was built in the 1920s. There were a lot of strange occurrences in the apartment before this event, but I thought nothing of it. My husband was in college at the time working on his associate's degree. Neither of us was working. I had no cell service at this point, and my husband's phone was our only real working phone. I had a phone with no service on it except for an internet service called Magic Jack, so that I could call out when he was in class in case I needed help. If it went to voicemail, it would record everything. This is important to this story. One morning, he calls the Magic Jack line to check in on me. He heard the line pick up, then nothing but static. Next morning, my husband had woken me up before, as usual. It was a day off for him. He wakes me up in hysterics. Something had been captured on the line. He played it for me. There was a very clear growl, and then a voice saying what sounds like, "Leave." Very gravelly and angry. Up until this point, my husband didn't believe in the paranormal. He was made a believer that day. Have any of you had something like this happen to you before? How did it change your outlook on the unknown? At the time when this happened, I was around 12 years old, living with my mom in a run-down apartment complex. The building we lived in was the smallest of the 3 in the complex, and it was shaped like an L, with our apartment being closest to the inside corner on the shorter side of the L. To our right was one other apartment with another single mother and her son, who was much younger than me. Below us was a family with 2 kids that I was friends with, and the apartment above us was empty. It wasn't the nicest area, so after dark we kept our windows and doors closed and locked. The reason I'm going into such detail is so that you can understand why I believe that this voice didn't come from anywhere other than in our apartment. We were up late one night. It was around 11 p.m., and my mom was looking at something on her computer. She and I would typically stay up late hanging out together, so this was completely usual behavior. The computer was tucked into one corner of our quote-unquote dining room, basically just a patch of linoleum off from the kitchen, and our living room was to our backs. We didn't have the TV on, nor did we have any other lights on other than the one in the dining room itself. I can't remember what we were looking at, but I do recall this sudden feeling that we were being watched. Many things that I attribute to unexplained paranormal activity happened while we were living here, so the feeling of being watched was incredibly uncomfortable, but not anything out of the ordinary. As I was beginning to shift in my seat to turn and look around, we both heard a sinister male voice say, "Meow." Conversation level, neither a whisper nor a yell, drawn out in an exaggerated, almost lilting tone, as if it were mocking us. I would say it took around 2 to 3 seconds for this voice to finish, and in that time I was able to feel every hair on my entire body stand on end. We immediately spun around, me nearly falling out of my chair to the floor, both of us nearly hyperventilating in absolute terror. My mom said something about, "If you aren't good, get the fuck out," or something to that effect. I'm honestly not sure how I slept that night, or any of the other nights we were there for, but we never heard anything like that again. When I was in middle school, I went to a friend's birthday party sleepover where we did the typical girl things like painted nails, did makeovers, and watched a movie. It was all normal until my friend suggested that we make a Ouija board. On a sheet of paper, we scribbled out yes, no, goodbye, along with numbers and the alphabet. She told us all the rules, and we nodded in agreement that we would follow. I remember the first movement happening, and I looked across to the girl facing me, insisting that she had moved it. She said that it was not her that moved the clear pebble that we were all using as a planchette. We asked it dumb questions like who we each liked and if our crushes liked us. Typical middle school girl things. I don't remember much of these sessions other than a particular name, Wanda, and that we had asked her if she was a demon and that she had told us that she was not. After a while, this was no longer scary and we began to enjoy it more and more. I remember feeling so excited, like I just wanted to keep on playing as if it were a video game. The next day, I told my dad about it. My family was pretty open-minded about those things, so he wasn't mad or ashamed. He just wanted to make sure that we were all safe about it. Fast forward, and I was in my first year of college over at a friend's place for her birthday, and she had talked about how she found a Ouija board and that we should try it. I was a little hesitant, as now I realized the true implications. We eventually started setting boundaries, but I was still hesitant to believe that the planchette was actually moving on its own. My friend asked questions like, "When's my birthday?" and "What's my name?" I shifted to questions not about myself, tending to ask about the entity rather than me. My friend suddenly asked if the spirit knew my deceased grandfather's name, and it spelled out Lewis. I was in shock because none of my friends could have known that. I know that I hadn't directed the planchette to the letters, so I was surprised to see that it was correct. Later on, another friend of mine had said that she felt something grab her foot under the table. I was right next to her, and I didn't feel a thing. At that point, I was like, okay, let's say goodbye and call it a night. It was all just too weird. I've never had a truly bad experience, but it's still very creepy, to say the least. This happened around 13 years ago when I was a sophomore in college, attending a liberal arts school in Suffolk County, New York. Within the first month or two of freshman year, I had found myself in a very tight-knit group of fellow theater geeks, 6 guys, myself included, and 1 girl. And they all loved horror movies and ghost stories. I had found my crew. Freshman year was tough, but we all held each other up and made the whole experience more enjoyable for one another. At the beginning of sophomore year, we decided that in October, as the Halloween season was ramping up, we would find a creepy, wooded spot in a nearby town some night and scare the crap out of ourselves. We did some research and found that there was a particularly isolated area about 30 minutes away, infamous for paranormal sightings. Perfect. The 7 of us split into 2 different cars and headed out into the night. Allow me to set the scene. You turn off of a very busy main road, flooded with strip malls and restaurants and whatnot, and you're almost immediately greeted by complete darkness. Again, this area was very heavily wooded. It was essentially a large web of winding roads surrounded by trees. Very few streetlights and very few houses. Without a GPS or a good sense of direction, one could easily get lost in there. We all made sure to have fully charged phones and flashlights just in case, but the goal was to keep driving until we collectively decided to pull over and go exploring. So, per the directions, we made a left off of the main road, driving about 30 minutes or so into this dark network, picking directions at random, just getting intentionally lost. Our cars made a turn and, to our surprise, there was a huge log in front of us. We had reached a dead end of some kind, with nothing but trees beyond it. We all got out to see exactly what this was, stepped over the log, and noticed 2 narrow trails leading off in different directions. This seemed like as good a time as any to grab our flashlights and do some amateur ghost hunting. We flipped a coin and set off on the trail to the right. The trail was so narrow that we had to walk single file to avoid getting whacked by branches. For whatever reason, I ended up in the back. I'm usually pretty rational and level-headed, but I have to say, the further we went in, the more I was overcome with an uneasy feeling. I kept hearing sounds deep in the woods, unable to shake the sense that we were being watched. But I seemed to be the only one who heard these things, so I shrugged it off as my imagination. In any case, the whole point of us being there was to get scared. Not to mention the fact that we were 7 able-bodied college students. What would we come across that could take us down? We headed down this trail for about 20 minutes, and just when I thought it would never end, we came to a massive clearing. And I mean massive. It was a large, open field of unkempt grass. Comparable in scope to a golf course, but not nearly as well manicured. The trees surrounded the entire field, which was so large we could not see the end of it from where we were standing. I was so thrilled to get out of that narrow trail, but I don't think any of us were expecting to find an area so vast. One of us looked to the right and said, "Hey, check that out." We all turned and there was an old, dilapidated house several hundred yards away. The house was completely dark, with no cars or signs of anyone actually living there. We walked over and shined our flashlights at it, and sure enough, the windows and doors were all boarded up. I peered between the boards on one of the windows, and what I could see was an old white couch covered in plastic, but an otherwise empty room. Whoever used to live there, they were long gone. Because there was no way in, and because we all felt sufficiently creeped out by the house anyway, we all decided to walk closer to the trail we had come in from, have a seat in the field, and figure out where to go next. We walked back towards the narrow trail, but before we could sit, my friend Mark stopped what he was doing. His expression dropped, and he pointed. We all turned, and on a very far side of the field, directly across from where we had come in, we could see someone tall, lanky, and pale dancing among the trees. By dancing, I mean that it was skipping around, grabbing a tree, swinging around it, and then doing the same thing to another one. Basically kind of like a do-si-do type motion. The moon was so bright, and the woods were so dark. It actually took a second for us to really understand what we were looking at. Jay, the 6'4" skeptic of the group, wasn't seeing it. I leaned into him, pointed in that direction, and said, "Jay, look where I'm pointing. Don't you see that?" He squinted a bit, and the second that he did see it, he gasped with everything that he had, clutched my arm, and whispered, "What the fuck is that?" What happened next sent shockwaves through all of us. Whoever it was, they stopped dancing, looked in our direction, and started charging straight at us. Without even thinking, we freaked and ran back to the trail. Yet again, Jay was the only one who didn't see what was happening. He shouted after us, "Guys, what is it? Where are you going?" After about 15 seconds of running like hell, I heard Jay scream, "Holy shit!" I looked back and saw his flashlight following the rest of us into the trail. While the walk into the woods took about 20 minutes, we made it back to our 2 cars, hopped in, and were peeling away in closer to 5. Once we were at a safe distance, we pulled over, got out, and checked in with each other about what had just happened. My heart was pounding, and I knew everyone else was feeling the same way. Nearly 15 years later, we are all still friends, living in different states yet keeping in touch through marriages, divorces, children, etc. But occasionally, out of the blue, one of us will send a group text to the others something to the effect of, "The woods. That really happened, right?" It most certainly did. That experience is always in the back of my mind. and I'm pretty sure it always will be. Here's the thing that still resonates with me about that night. Whoever that was, they were dancing maniacally in the woods at 1 in the morning, and then ran directly for a group of young adults, not at all fazed by the fact that they were severely outnumbered. Did that thing know we were there from the second we parked? Was it the sound that I kept hearing when we walked the trail? Whatever the case may be, when he came for us that night, you can be sure none of us wanted to stick around to see what he was truly capable of. It's 12:44 a.m., and 10 minutes ago, I saw a ghost. I live in the basement, which is almost finished, so it isn't the creepy, empty stages anymore. It's really comfortable and homey. Today, though, my parents are putting up a new wall separating my room from the laundry room, so that's the change. It's a little uncomfortable tonight, and I do admit that having such an open space where I could see and not see everything is a little spooky, but I wasn't actively thinking about it, and I was actually really relaxed and just scrolling through TikTok on my phone. This is the setup. I have my bed in the middle of the room, my TV is adjacent from me, on, playing Family Guy. I'm facing left, which is facing the laundry room, and the almost built wall. There's a small landing that goes to my sister's room, which is also in the basement. The back storage room, which the light was on, and then the stairs that go up. My fan, which is also to my left, is on. I can't hear a whole lot besides the fan, my phone, and the TV. My phone is positioned almost directly in front of my face, but with what I saw, it was not in my peripheral, it was directly next to my phone's screen, so I clearly saw it. A half-white figure walked past from the landing into the laundry room. I could only see the bottom half of it. It was clearly opaque white. I thought it was my dog at first, so I sat up and called her name a few times, but she didn't come. Then I thought maybe it was my parents and they just couldn't hear me, but I didn't see the laundry room light turn on, or the washing machine or anything turn on. So I turned on my flashlight and called my dog's name again, thinking that she might be getting into something. When she still didn't come to me, I got up with my flashlight still on and turned the bedroom light on. Then I checked everything out to see if it was my dog, and if she was just being silly, or maybe even if it was a cat. Nothing was there, so I got freaked out and went to my sister's room, which her light was on, and the storage room light was on. My sister wasn't in her room, she was in the garage. So I told her what had happened, and she thinks my mind is probably just playing tricks on me since there's changes going on downstairs, and it's a little scary down there right now. Which, I admit, it is, but I was really comfortable, and about to go to sleep. I have been in those instances where I freak myself out, like watching a scary movie or something, and I convince myself that I heard or saw something, but of course nothing happened, and I sleep fine. But tonight it was different. I just know it. As soon as I figured out that it wasn't my dog or my parents or any cats, I began to feel nauseous and my heart started pounding. Now, this isn't the first time a paranormal experience has happened in this house. It's just the first time in a while. Recently, my grandmother passed away upstairs in what's now my parents' bedroom. My grandfather also passed away in this house in the hallway going to the garage. Every paranormal experience we've had, we know that it was one of my grandparents, since it was never malvoyant and we never felt nervous or scared. I'm not saying the spirit I saw was malvoyant. I do believe that it was my grandma, but it still did freak me out, and I did cry. It's only been a month and a half without her, so it's nice to know she's still around. But it was awful timing, Grandma. I'm now sleeping upstairs until my parents finish the wall. Good spirit or not, it's still nerve-wracking to have a paranormal experience. When I was about 15 years old, I was a very curious teenager. I had only heard stories of the Ouija board, but had never actually tried it. So one weekend, my best friend slept over, and we decided to take our chances. My mom was super against me buying one, and she would have killed me if I would have brought one into her home. So my best friend and I took a big poster board and made our own Ouija board. We lit candles and turned off all the lights. It was about 1 a.m., and everyone in the house was asleep. When we started out, it was slow, but then the planchette started moving all around the board. I was convinced that my best friend was the one moving the piece around, but she denied it, and I trusted her not to lie. We asked how they died, and they just said, sick. After a bunch of other questions, we asked, how can you prove that you are who you really say that you are? They responded with, cemetery. I don't fully remember all the questions that we asked, but I know that it led to Charlie giving us some details. He said that his gravestone was by a path and a tree, small, round, with the year 1820. My mom's house is literally right across the street from a cemetery. I can look out the window and directly into it, so we are very, very close. It is an extremely old, historical colonial cemetery dating back to 1690. The next day, my best friend and I went over to the burial ground and started our wild goose chase for Charlie's headstone. Lo and behold, we found it. It was exactly as he described. His headstone was cylinder-shaped, the name Charlie was listed, and he was born in 1810 and died in 1820. Behind the stone was a huge tree, and it was right next to a pathway. I could not believe that the Ouija board actually worked. After discovering Charlie's grave, my best friend and I would sit and visit him every day after school. We would go hang out there when we were bored. Sometimes we would just sit next to him, smoke cigarettes, and talk. Maybe Charlie was just one lonely kid and wanted some friends. So that's what we gave him. So I've been sitting on this story for 3 years, telling some close friends who respond with astonished looks and advise on mental health and think I'm completely insane. It's 11:17 in rural New Brunswick, Canada, and I'm getting in my car to head back to Fredericton from my parents' place in the middle of nowhere. I had just finished up a small gig at a local fair, having had 1 or 2 beers at the show. I'm just pulling out of my parents' driveway onto a dim country road going back to the city when I turn on my high beams to see a tall, lanky, completely black figure standing in the ditch on the right side of the road. I mean, this thing must have been 8 or 9 feet tall. It absorbed all light and had limbs no bigger around than a baguette. As soon as I saw it, it started to run up the ditch and across the road in a very fast, very strange, gliding kind of way. I slammed on the brakes and watched this thing run across the road and into a field on the other side of the road towards some woods. I'm getting goosebumps writing this, but I could still see its silhouette speeding across the field in my neighbor's yard as it went into the black of the night. I stopped for a moment, shivering, before speeding up the road to a safe distance. I had no idea what I had just seen, so I called my mom to tell her that I had just witnessed this tall, alien-looking creature less than 100 meters from our home. She and my sister searched online with what I had told them, and came back with an article on the black stickman phenomena, which fit exactly what I had seen on this normal August night in New Brunswick. This experience has really opened my mind to the paranormal, so for that I'm almost thankful. I was looking over my shoulder for a few weeks, afraid to go out at night, and I still feel unnerved when thinking about it. I haven't seen anything like it since, but have had some experiences with spirits growing up in what my whole family agrees is a haunted house. This is a story that happened to me when I was just a fresh graduate, starting my first job at a temp agency. It was 2002, and my job was located in the middle of nowhere and very far from my home. Therefore, I took the effort of doing most of my job in the office till late at night, since I do not wish to come home and continue with work. Rather, that would give me some rest for the remainder of the night. I usually stayed up even later on Fridays, knowing that if I finished the work fully, the weekends would be golden for me. So, this story occurred on one of those Fridays when everyone else had already left. After making my prayers for the night, I continued with my work. There was no one I believed that was in the office, but I felt a presence. Perhaps it was another coworker working late just like me. I took that belief to heart. At one point in time, around 11 I believe, I needed to go to the toilet, which was located at the end of a long, dark hallway lighted only by the green exit sign. I found that the toilet was locked, so I looked to the toilet that is on the next level. I took the staircase, which was lighted by a circular wall lamp, and found that the toilet was unlocked. Thankfully, I did my business and returned back to work. The next part of the story comes in a rather weird way. As I made my way back, passing by the locked toilet, I saw the shadow of someone by the office door beaming from the front light that I had left on. My guess is that either the coworker was about to leave or that she was taking coffee for the night since the pantry is near the entrance. When I got there, there was no one by the pantry or the entrance, so again I went back to my desk. I was trying to finish up that last bit of work when I started to peek through the gap between each desk, trying to see the other person who was working late at night, but somehow, no matter what, I was unable to spot him or her. When I got finished up about 15 minutes later, I decided to get myself a drink from the pantry. Then, the lights went off. Just as I took the can of juice from the fridge, I turned to find myself in total darkness. There was a voice calling out to me, trying to reach me, and I tried to find it. The voice was unclear at the beginning, but soon it became what I think the person was saying, "Help me." The sound was the strongest by the window which was facing the main road that was now deserted. I looked about in the darkness, seeing if there was anyone in distress, and as I did so, I felt a hand touching my shoulder. I turned around, and no one was there. At this point already, I knew that I needed to get the hell out, and so I went to my desk and started packing. Then it came. It came from outside, falling with a piercing scream and with a clear face. The face of a bloody woman. I quickly rushed to the window, opened it up, and looked at the ground, but there was no one. I made my way to the ground floor and to the main road, clutching my laptop and backpack as I tried to search for a cab, but it felt like nearly hours, despite it only being minutes before one came by. What kept me at the edge was the fact that I felt like 1,000 boots were marching toward me, shouting in Japanese commands. I kept my eyes on the road, but occasionally I turned back to see my office building. On the last turn, I saw a bunch of uniformed men with rifles, gray faces bayoneting a bloody woman, stepping on her body, throwing what I believed to be her baby in the air and killing it as it landed on the ground. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran from the scene. People often wonder what would happen if they used a Ouija board. Some people do it for fun. Some people use it for spiritual communications. I can tell you now that if you have no experience in using a Ouija board, do not do it. This is a story about what happens when you use one for fun without knowing the consequences. When I was about 12, it was Halloween night, go figure, and we had just had a Halloween party for family and friends. A few of my older sister's friends stayed the night that night, and we were just hanging out in our room, which we shared. One of her friends had a spirit tethered to her. That's what she claimed. Whether or not it was true, I still don't know to this day, and she said, "Let's go for it." I wanted nothing to do with it, but being 12 years old and curious, I had to observe. They didn't follow any of the rules that you're supposed to as far as not putting it on a blanket, not lighting the proper candles, and other things that you're supposed to do prior to using the Ouija board. They were just calling on spirits that they could think of and trying to communicate with them. That's where things got a little creepy. If I remember correctly, one of the spirits that came to the board was a woman, and she was not friendly. She began to spell out profanities, and they quickly shut that down. I can't remember what the second spirit was, but it was also not friendly and called itself Satan. All of a sudden, one of my sister's friends began to panic. She said she saw a man out on the street with a red and black face. We did not see the man out on the street, so I don't know if she was having a panic attack and seeing things, or what. The next event that occurred was kind of insane and terrifying. All of a sudden, my sister started zoning out and staring at nothing. We tried to get her attention, and she gave no response. Then she got up and walked downstairs, and we were confused, so we just followed her. We heard something in the kitchen, so we went and checked that out. My sister was standing over the sink taking knives from the counter in the knife holder, and she was throwing them into the sink one after the other. We tried to get her attention again, and again she refuses to respond to us. Then she goes and grabs the coffee pot off of the coffee maker and drinks black coffee straight out of it. Mind you, she hated coffee at the time. She drank the entire thing. She got up and went to sit on the couch, and a couple of minutes later, she blinked and came to. She asked us why we were staring at her, and how did she get downstairs. To this day, she has no memory of what happened, and it is 21 years later. We're pretty sure that a spirit took over her body just to have some fun. My grandma, after my mom told her what had happened, came into the house and blessed it with holy water. It seemed to help for a while, and then I had the series of nightmares a year or so later, so I'm wondering if the holy water didn't really have much effect. So this is a lesson learned and a disclaimer to anyone who wants to mess with a Ouija board. If you have no real experience with it, do not go there. You never know what you're going to be inviting into your home. When I was younger and inexperienced, I decided to go to a spot in my small town that is supposed to be haunted. The story goes back to the 60s, when a man and a woman with 2 children got into a major argument, and she decided to leave with her kids. She packed up and left with her son and daughter, and began to head over a small bridge just south of town, when she noticed that the husband was coming after her in his vehicle. Outraged, he ran her off the bridge and killed her and the 2 children. She now wanders the bed of what used to be a river, looking for her kids. So my buddy and I were investigating there, and we didn't hear anything, so we decided to go to the other side of the river. We were using EVP only at that time. The few hours we stayed there, we didn't pick up anything. We went home, transferred the sound to a computer, and plugged the computer into our television, and then we heard a few sounds. One was at a time in the investigation when my buddy had tripped over a stick poking out of the ground, and you could hear a little girl giggling. The second was when we decided to move to the other side of the river and announced to the ghosts present that we were moving, and we heard the most eerie, slow-speaking voice of the little girl that said, "Please don't leave me." We were never touched or harmed in any way, but after a while we realized that we failed to introduce ourselves and that we did not ask anything present to not follow or attach itself to us. The night afterward, my mother told me that she was going to take a bath and asked us if anyone else had to use the restroom. My friends and I said no, and we continued to play our video game. Next thing we know, we heard screams coming from the bathroom. My stepfather ran into the bathroom, and my mother came out wrapped in a towel, mad and upset that we went ghost hunting, and she believed that something was messing with her. She went to her room and got dressed, and came back out and said that her back was burning. I lifted up the back of her shirt to see my initials scratched into her skin. At this time, I was a bit worried and frightened, and I told her to lay on the couch so that I could keep an eye on her, as she said that she was tired. She then woke up a few hours later, but didn't seem fully awake, almost as if she were in a trance, sweating profusely, and her hair was soaked. She began mumbling weird things that we couldn't understand, and started saying 666 and drawing a pentagram in the air with her finger. I decided to look up a prayer, hoping that this would help. I ended up finding the St. Michael prayer, and my friends and I began chanting it. As we were chanting, she began screaming and cursing in a disembodied voice, and then suddenly dropped back down to the couch and passed back out. She woke up like nothing had even happened, and was confused as we explained. After time passed and nothing else occurred, I decided to go to a friend's house who was female. As I was headed there, I got a text message notification that said, "Where are you going? You're not..." I clicked on the notification to finish reading the message, but the text had vanished. I called my mother and asked if anyone from the house had messaged me, and she said no. So ignoring it, I went on over to my friend's house. It was around 1 a.m., so we went to her room and laid in bed, and she got up saying that she had to go to the restroom. As I lay there, I began to hear growling noises coming from her bedroom closet. When she got back, because I wasn't going to go and look, I asked, "Do you have a dog in your closet or something?" And she replied, "No, I don't own a dog. We're not allowed to have animals here." I was freaked out the rest of the night, and didn't fall asleep until almost 4 a.m., listening to see if I could hear anything else. After awakening, of course, I was really tired. I called my mother to make sure everything was okay, and she said that nothing else happened while I was gone. And nothing else has happened since. Moral of the story is don't meddle in things that you don't understand or have not studied or prepared to deal with. I'm still interested in ghost hunting, and may do so in the future as I'm now more educated on the subject, and will take better precautions from here on out. This happened when I was around 10, in a house where the second floor was still under construction. My mom and grandma had a major disagreement back when we were living in Toronto, and my grandma decided to move to her home country, Ecuador. Soon after, due to complications, my mom decided to give in and follow her. We moved in with my grandma, but since the house was a little small for 4 people, and since my great-grandmother was soon to be moving in as well, my family decided to extend a floor. For the meantime, my great-grandma was staying in a room extension with her own bathroom because she would have accidents frequently. The room was an extension outside, close to the main door. My great-grandma was really old, but still cognitive enough to have fun conversations with, so I would spend a lot of time talking with her outside. She started telling me about this little green guy that would visit her at night, and he would just sit on the TV and watch her. In South America, we grew up talking about duendes, leprechauns that would mess with people wandering around strange areas at night. It's kind of our folklore, like the chupacabras or skinwalkers. But since my grandma was getting old, my mom would just brush it off and blame it on her aging or her mental health. One night my family went to a dinner party, but since I had a best friend over, I insisted on staying home. It was getting really late, but we were waiting for one of our favorite shows to air on Cartoon Network. My family is very religious and hated these quote-unquote demonic cartoons, so we tried to watch quietly. I was under the impression that my great-grandma was resting in one of the rooms behind us, in my mom's room, because I kept hearing noises coming from down the hall. Suddenly, I hear my grandma's walker clicking its way out of the room, so I quickly turned off the TV and told my friend to be quiet. We hid under the blankets and waited until my grandma went back to the room. She used to walk with one of those four-legged walkers, and would take her time as she moved. We thought she was just going to use the washroom, so we decided to wait it out. Her walking seemed very quiet, though, which was odd, but I didn't think much of it. She went to the washroom, but didn't open up the toilet lid. There was no noise, no peeing or anything. And the weirdest part? No word or call to see if we were sleeping or still up. We just heard the walking go straight back to the room quietly. Then suddenly I remembered that the dinner my family went to was meant to celebrate her. She wasn't home, and we were supposed to be alone. As soon as I realized that, we heard small footsteps sprinting from one room to the other, and then a glass breaking. We were petrified. We didn't know what was behind us, if it was someone that broke in or an animal, but we were too afraid to look. We stayed under the sheets until my family came back home. Fortunately, they arrived only moments after. As soon as my stepdad came in, we told him what happened. He brought my dog upstairs where the second floor was being built, as he was thinking that it would have been an animal that came in since the staircase was only being covered by a plastic sheet. My mom goes into my grandma's room and finds a glass jug on the floor with a broken handle. The jug was supposed to be in my room. Something had to have carried the jug and dropped it in there. My dog was also barking throughout the night, which was pretty common, but when he came in the house, he seemed really anxious to sprint upstairs, as if he knew something was there. My best friend and I have been through a couple of weird things back home, but nothing as vivid as this. Again, it could have been an animal, but that doesn't explain the metal walker noise that we heard. It could have been an intruder, but we would have definitely seen someone come through the plastic covering the stairwell. It could have been the little green guy my great-grandma talked about. A lot of times little shadows would rush through my peripherals, but I always thought it was just my imagination. She passed away only a couple months after this. But weird small footsteps and random dog chases never stopped. The footsteps I would hear didn't sound like small critters, since animals tend to bolt from place to place. The steps I remember hearing as a kid seemed much more meticulous and slow, and always late at night. This is a story from my life that I've told to people, especially teens, to warn them to never use a Ouija board. When I was a senior in high school in 1989, my brother came home from college on spring break and told stories about him and some friends using a Ouija board. It had done some things to freak them out, so we dug out the one that we had in our attic. I don't know why we had it or where we got it from. He showed me what they had done, but nothing happened to us. I brought it to a friend's house and we tried it out a few times over the course of several evenings, and then about the third or fourth time, it really started to pick up in its responses. We had been starting by knocking 3 times on the corner of the board and saying something like, "Come, spirit," or something to that effect. Anyway, the marker really started to move around the board and spell things out. I always tell people that it was either our subconsciouses or a spirit moving it around, because I was certain that neither of us were moving it intentionally. With a light touch of a few fingers from each of our hands, it would just move around on its own as if it had its own personality. We would ask it all the usual questions, test questions, and curiosity ones. One day, though I wasn't a fan of it, my friend asked the board in which years we would each die. It spelled out something like 2040 or 40-ish for my friend. I don't actually remember the number, just that it was far into the future at the time. and 1990 for me, which was the next year. I asked, does that mean that I'm going to die in 1990 and my friend in 2040? No, it said. Then I asked again, this time switching the years around between us. Yes, it said. We asked the spirit about itself. It claimed that it had died the year my friend's father was born, and said that its name was Stephen Crane. We kinda laughed at that part. Of course, I looked up some dates about the author after that, but things just didn't seem to jive. I just thought, well, it could be another person with that name, and moved on. We started to invite other friends over to watch, who are all entirely skeptical. By the end of the evening, every single one was freaked out. More and more friends would come each night until we started getting a huge group of people. The board would answer plenty of test questions wrong, but then, for example, while everyone's reacting to the wrong answer and half paying attention, it's spelling out, sorry. Another time, for example, in a lull between activity while people were distracted and chatting, it moved slowly to S, then kept circling around to H, until it came to a stop there. There was nothing else for about 2 minutes. The entire room of people was completely silent, and then it slowly moved to OK. It said a bad spirit had passed through the room. Once again, everyone freaked out. It didn't like this one friend, and every time he entered the room, when we had those gatherings, the marker would twist and move to the opposite side of the board. Other things like that happened. Again, it was like it had its own personality. I remember a few times driving home with that thing in the backseat of the car, terrified, with my heart pounding. One time I asked it, where will I go to college? It spelled out one of the schools I was applying to, and then 37. I asked it if I was going to go to that school and get a 3.7 GPA the first semester, and it said yes. I was sure all along that my friend was not moving it intentionally, but I had proof, because one day he was really disturbed and frustrated with his girlfriend, a friend of mine. He had suspected that she was cheating on him, and he asked the board a question about her while using it with a friend, and it told him to turn on the TV. The video for the song, What You Don't Know Might Hurt You, by Exposé, was playing on TV. I remember that he really took that to heart, and it affected his trust in their relationship. I always knew that he wasn't just playing around with the board, and that was a sort of hard proof to that fact. We started to actually use the board with our friends, but it only worked when one of us two used it with someone else. We asked the spirit why that was, and it responded that the spirit was inside my friend and that I was the owner of the board. Freaky stuff thinking back on it now, but as an 18-year-old you think differently. Anyway, the enthusiasm started to peter out after a few months, maybe near the end of the summer, and I don't really know what happened to the Ouija board. I did end up going to that college that the board mentioned, but it didn't really catch my attention. When I got home for my first semester after 1990 had just begun, I got my grades, and had a 3.7 GPA. I don't remember if I made the connection or not, but I certainly did when the next thing happened. Around the same week or so, maybe even around the same day, I got the annual catalog that my college sends out, with articles and updates and whatnot. I opened it up, and there, right in front of me, was an entire article about Stephen Crane. He had gone to my college for a while, and I never had any clue about it. I remember having chills. Finally, the sad part is that later in 1990, after returning to college classes after Thanksgiving break, my friend, one of my best friends, died suddenly and unexpectedly from a heart problem. I don't know when I made the connection with the board, because by then it was over a year later. But at some point, I did, and when I did, I started to put the whole storyline together. It sank in more how creepy and dark the whole thing was. I am happy in life, very blessed. I did go through a form of spiritual growth some years ago where this darkness was left behind, and the story of my past doesn't haunt me. I share it in the hope that it's helpful for others. but I would never touch a Ouija board again, and would strongly advise against anyone else using one. To this day, I'm still positive that it was not our conscious action at work, but either our subconsciouses or truly a spirit. Whichever of those you might believe that it is, nothing good comes from playing around with either one of them. At the minimum, negligence can open up a path for psychological and emotional problems. At worst, relating with a spirit can let in a darkness and fear beyond your understanding or strength that can tint your life and affect you for quite some time to come. It was in June of 1972 that my mom and dad told me they were taking a couple of our thoroughbred racehorses to Durango, Colorado, where my father owned land, and where we typically boarded some of the animals during the summer. This trip was nothing unusual, as it occurred rather frequently. The only difference this time was that my mother was going with my dad instead of me. I guess Dad figured that at 13, I was old enough and responsible enough to do the morning and evening chores, which consisted of feeding and watering the remaining horses, which numbered about 8. A few cows, 6 pigs, and a coop full of chickens. There were also always a few wounds that needed to be smeared with ointment. These chores were not exactly rocket science, but it did take a while, so I was glad when Lyle offered to come and help me with each evening. He got a kick out of it, as he enjoyed that kind of thing. I, however, leaned more towards the arts, performing magic, singing, playing the piano, and even doing ventriloquism. In fact, I did it professionally by the time I was 12. I had no intention of staying at the house alone while my parents were gone to Colorado. I was very much afraid of the dark, and especially of being alone. It would be years until I discovered why. I was going to spend the weekend with 2 of my best friends, Lyle and Mark Harper. Lyle was a year older than I was, and Mark was a year younger, so I fit right into the middle of the 2. They lived just 3 houses to the west of my house. I can't really call it a house that I lived in. It was one of 4 duplexes that my dad owned. 2 of them were built back in the early 1920s, and the other 2 were newer, as they were built by my dad a couple of years after we moved there in the late 1960s. The 2 old units, A and B, and the 2 new units, C and D, were split down the middle by our long asphalt driveway. The only other building on the property was a very old and very large white stucco garage/shop, which was located behind the units at the end of the driveway. Beyond that old shop was where the corrals and pastures were. With my parents in Colorado, I was in charge of keeping all the animals fed. Darkness was just around the corner, so I took Lyle and we headed to my place. As we entered my driveway, we started walking between the old units and the new units toward the big garage. What made this shop unique were the giant rolling stainless steel doors, one on the left and one on the right, that met in the middle. It created an almost mirror effect, but not quite shiny enough to be an actual mirror. I happened to be looking at the door, noticing how the street light created just enough glow to make our stretched shadows lightly appear on the big metal doors. I commented to Lyle that I wished I was that tall in real life, and that is when it happened. With both of us looking at our very light shadows bouncing to the rhythm of our steps, another shadow, only very dark, no, black. So black that it looked like a thick, inky, one-dimensional entity, ran clumsily across the shiny door from left to right. It was wearing what looked like a wide-brimmed fedora hat. It had a troll-like appearance, all hunched over as though it didn't want to be seen. It scurried quickly in total darkness until it reached the right side of the doors, after which it completely disappeared. We both stopped, frozen in our tracks, trying to comprehend what we had just witnessed. Before either of us could say anything, the thick, dark shadow man trotted back the other direction, once again disappearing as it reached the other side of the doors. Both of our minds instantly realized that nothing solid had run between us and the doors, and that the only way a shadow could be that dark was, well, there was just no way a regular shadow could be that dark. Without uttering a word, we both turned in sync, as though the movement was choreographed, and took off running back onto 8th Avenue. Neither of us stopped until we arrived back at the safety of Lyle's house. Once inside, we ran to his father, Lloyd, who was watching the news on television, and told him that we needed him. We related our experience, and he said that he was sure that there was a logical explanation. I knew, though, that there was not. He walked back to my house with us, and we began to experiment, attempting to recreate a shadow that was as dark as what we had just seen 10 minutes before. It just wasn't possible. Mr. Harper agreed to stay with us while I did my chores in the now dark back pasture area. It would be years later that I would learn about shadow figures and how they operate. Since then, I have been blessed, or cursed, with several paranormal experiences, from full-body apparitions to simply feeling the presence of spirits. I'm not sure why me, but I am grateful. So I had to shut it off so that I could live a normal life again without seeing them. But my cousin, who has no abilities, has seen them in the house. At first, when he moved in, he didn't know that it was haunted. I didn't want to tell him that the house was haunted because I thought, well, maybe it's not. And if I told him, he would believe it was, and that would influence him in some way. If it was haunted, I was going to let him find out on his own, or if it didn't bother him, then I would let it be. As the weeks passed and things moved in front of our eyes, he started to hear his family members' voices calling his name from time to time in the middle of the night. It was the same experience that I had had. He would have a nightmare sometimes of something trying to come inside of the room, yet it was stuck on the other side of the door, unable to get in. It was beckoning him to let it inside, to open the door. It's odd because I actually have a video of it doing that, and it's heard in the video faintly. When I lived alone, it would occur very frequently, but instead of in dreams, it was literally in real life and happening on camera. I did not show him the video beforehand, so there's no way he could have known. Eventually, I did open up to him about it being haunted, but that it's not really a big deal or anything, since my family ends up in the haunted house usually, for some odd reason. I explained that if we made excuses and such, that the activity would remain low. For instance, if something slides across the floor in front of us, we just pass it off as something else, no matter how stupid that excuse or rationalization is, and we say it out loud, shrug it off, and move on. Sometimes if it happens again after that, we just make another excuse, and then it stops. If something pounds on our walls from all directions, which only usually happens for a few seconds, we just ignore it and make another excuse, and then life goes on as normal. My cousin would be laying in bed at night, and he explained that he would see this almost rippling kind of apparition. I thought it must be an eyesight issue, so I asked him to show me where it was. Weirdly enough, it was the same wall that I had had a nightmare about months ago involving things trying to climb out of a black tar-like door with nearly 100 arms covered in the tar-like goo. So yeah, it was weird, and he didn't have that experience again. Anyway, in the room one day when I was living there on my own, I had seen a woman, pretty much the generic, typical ghost. Most of them don't seem to look like that in real life, but in movies they do. Just a young woman who floated through my bedroom door and then through the wall beside it. Nearly entirely see-through, and from the waist down, she looked as if she were made of mist or fog. No color at all, and also in a very old, almost wedding gown type of dress. Also in the room, I would often see glowing white, circular orb-like things that would float and then leave. Almost like a flicker, but I thought it was just, I don't know, a headache or whatever. But it was always in one spot of the room. Well, my cousin saw it too, again in the exact same spot that I would usually see it in. And then I told him that it happens sometimes. He's gotten used to the house, and most of the activity stopped happening after I shut it off. I also bought a little spirit box and would use it outside whenever the activity would go up. Soon after I went back inside, life was back to normal and the activity would subside for another month or two. Before the spirit box, the activity was nearly unlivable, dangerous almost. Now it's extremely silent, like we have an actual home now. If anything, it's just a house that happens to be haunted, but a house nonetheless. With all of the haunted houses my family and I have lived in, my only advice is to never let a haunting consume you. I'll let you decide whether or not she was really a vampire. Either way, I promise that this is a true story. It happened around December 2017. I had just finished high school, and one of my friends was hosting a house party. It was out in the country, large property, lovely view. It was a great place to celebrate the end of exams. I recognized a lot of people there and knew them quite well. However, there were two guests I didn't recognize, a boy and a girl. He was a stoic character with a solid build, not quite muscle, not quite fat, not quite someone that you would want to annoy. She was a thin figure with long amber hair and fair skin. He would scan the crowds while she shyly cradled a bottle. No one else was paying any attention to them, and I could tell they felt uncomfortable. They seemed nice enough, so I grabbed a friend and walked over to them, hoping that I could put them at ease. My friend left pretty quickly, but the girl seemed relieved that I was paying attention to them. She told me her name was Verity. Bit of an unusual name, but I thought it was pretty. Her boyfriend seemed a bit more comfortable too, but he didn't say much. I don't recall his name. Verity and I chatted for a while, but I was quickly running out of small talk. I asked her about the alcohol she was drinking and what kind she prefers, that sort of thing. She replied casually, it's okay, but my favorite substance is blood. I think that's a good cue to run away, but my curiosity got the better of me. I asked her why she enjoyed the taste of blood. I've cut my lip before, and I remember the taste being quite sour. She told me that the flavor is dependent on a person's health. The healthier they are, the sweeter their blood. It suddenly made sense as to why her boyfriend was built like an athlete. She taught me a few weird things about hematology, and was very knowledgeable about medieval execution methods. She explained them with a strange fondness. It was almost nostalgia. I only knew the Viking blood eagle, but that was enough to get her excited. We ended up talking all night. I listened to her gore-filled lectures, and they both listened to me as well. Even though my interests in stories were much less interesting in comparison, they didn't seem to mind. They smiled and encouraged me. In between subjects, Verity would draw some blood from her boyfriend, either with her nails or her fangs. He seemed okay with it. I talked to her boyfriend for a short while, too. We got along just fine, but we had very little in common, so it was a bit tricky to hold a conversation. He was into sports and cars, so he was probably human. After a while, I tried to encourage them to meet my friends. Verity, however, didn't like that. She was very possessive and insisted that I stay with them all night. I wasn't in the mood to argue with a bloodthirsty historian, and she was being very friendly with me. so I agreed. She didn't bite me once, and I'm grateful her boyfriend was there to feed her. Maybe she was a vampire, or maybe she just had some really weird habits. Either way, I hope you enjoyed my story. Last night, my boyfriend went into the room next to our bedroom to play video games while I watched Parks and Rec on my phone on low volume in bed. After an hour or so, he ran in and asked, "Is everything okay?" I stared blankly at him. "Yeah? Why?" He then said he'd heard someone wailing, loudly, and that it sounded like my voice. It couldn't have been Parks and Rec, because I wasn't watching an episode with any sound in it like that, not to mention that the volume was too low to be heard in the other room. It couldn't have been me because I was just chilling. Additionally, I had not heard any wailing sound at all. He said he'd heard it through his gaming headphones a couple of times, wasn't quite sure what it was, took them off, heard it a third time clearly, and then came to check on me. This is strange because a few nights before, I was feeling incredibly ill with severe chills to the point where I couldn't leave the blankets to get more blankets. I was calling for help, and he heard nothing through his headphones. They're pretty good at canceling outside noise, plus he plays the game music at high volume. So who was the wailing woman? This past weekend, my boyfriend came over and we were hanging out downstairs. I soon got tired, so I ended up going upstairs to my bedroom. I immediately felt a presence following me as I walked up the stairs. It felt as if it were following behind me, and there was something breathing on my neck, the feeling when you know that something is there. Me being scared, I refused to look back. I just plop into bed and face the wall, hoping that nothing happens. I still feel like there's something there, but this time it feels like someone is just watching me sleep. Then it starts to get hot. Even though I was scared, I turned to open the window, and there is a holographic type of ghost hovering over my bed. I turn around again, not getting up. I lay there facing my wall, so uncomfortable for a minute or two. I quickly get the courage to open the window and go lay back in bed, but before I get there, my LED TV starts flashing and changing the color mode. Mind, these lights only turn on when the TV is on because they're connected to my TV's USB, and I was unable to turn them on myself when the TV was off. I quickly grabbed the remote and turned it off. Then, all of a sudden, the empty Starbucks cup sitting on my nightstand table falls off in a weird way, as in it looks as if it were being pushed. I turned on my bedroom light, grabbed my phone, and yeeted out of there. I was so terrified. I was 19 years old and a trainee manager for Sainsbury's, a UK supermarket chain. I was working with a colleague on the shop floor, looking down the aisle. I saw a 30-something-year-old mother pushing a very severely deformed child in a wheelchair. Although I wasn't aware then, but since have become aware. I wasn't aware then, but since have become aware that the child had probably been born with hydrocephalus, leaving its head distended with fluid. The child also only had one arm, and was sort of curled up in the chair as if pained. As they passed us, we pulled our restocking trolley out of the way, and just as they were adjacent to us, the child let out a terrible sort of howl. To be honest, it left me shaken for several minutes. 2 or 3 days later on the weekend, I was invited to a party at a friend's place. Just a quiet meal and drinks with a few people that I knew. After food and a few drinks, the girl whose flat it was suggested that we try the Ouija board that she had recently bought. I was a total skeptic of the Ouija, although agreed to play for a bit of fun. It was a proper sort of wooden painted board, although there was no pointer, just a small crystal glass that those playing put their finger on. After about 20 minutes in, I thought it felt a bit odd the way that the glass felt like it was gliding so smoothly over the board and actually spelling out some of the responses to questions and even claiming to be a local spirit of our town. We carried on for a while and, although weird, nothing about the responses were threatening or unpleasant. My friend turned to me and said, "Ask it a question that nobody here or anyone else would know the answer to." I thought for a few seconds and spoke aloud. I was thinking of the child in the store, and I said, "What did I see at work the other day?" I felt the glass move under our fingers, and it said quickly, very positively, "Effing evil troll child." I felt physically sick and was actually heaving. I jumped away and fell onto the floor. I then blacked out for a few minutes, resulting in my friends calling an ambulance in panic. When it arrived, I had calmed down a bit, and they just checked my vitals and left. My friend drove me home, and although I was all right, I had nightmares involving that child for several months. Today I believe that there are definitely consequences to messing with that sort of stuff, and it is absolutely best left well alone. That was over 25 years ago, and I remember that incident as if it happened just yesterday. I've gathered a few paranormal encrypted stories after moving to North Carolina. The silver UFO, the shadow person, the 6 lights, etc. But this one stuck out to me the most. I've never even heard of this thing or even knew that this thing existed, and I was a kid when I saw it. It could be my mind exaggerating, but another person with me saw it, and it freaked us both out. We were driving along the back roads of North Carolina and learning the shortcuts and ways to get around as we had just moved here. It was the evening, and it was around false summertime, the time where it's hot randomly in the spring, so the windows were rolled down. We were just having fun cruising and sightseeing. The other person with me was driving and was chit-chatting to me about the smells and plants that I should stay away from. We were passing a cow farm, so we rolled up our windows, and the curve past the farm was coming up, so we rolled them back down. Now after you hit this curve, there's a hill and it flattens out into a straight but crummy road. In the middle of the road, something blackish was walking. It was shaggy, and was just walking all calm as if it was sightseeing too. I remember my friend asking, "What's this dog doing?" It looked as big as a black bear or a derpy St. Bernard, and it walked with a normal stride. We slowly crept up on it, hoping that it would hear the car and move out of the way, but it didn't. So my friend gave the horn a little tap, and this thing finally turned around. Its eyes were reflected from the headlights. It hunched down and hissed. When it turned, its tail lifted, and it was long and black. It then darted off into the woods. My friend was puzzled. I just sat there in disbelief at what I had just witnessed. It was an odd and quiet ride back home. Fast forward to more than a decade later, me and a few friends were looking at local urban legends because one of them swore up and down that they saw the ghost that everyone was talking about and wanted to know more about it. I'm zoning out because I'm an introvert, and went looking around in the website that we found. I see this title called The Vampire Beast of North Carolina and was like, what the hell? North Carolina's got a hillbilly vampire? I click on it and read. Some beast was terrorizing locals and their farm animals, leaving puncture wounds, no blood, and leaving the body there. Multiple bodies of dead animals in one night, all dead the same way. I scoffed and say El Chupacabra, like Dexter from Dexter's Laboratory, and kept scrolling. I read some more and saw, here's what witnesses recount seeing, and when I scrolled down to see a hand-drawn picture of it, I nearly shat bricks. The photo the eyewitnesses had drawn of what they saw looked exactly like what I had seen over a decade ago. The shape, the tail, the color. I went pale and exited out of the page and just sat there, thinking on my life's existence up to this point, wondering if I had some sort of brain damage, because I was like, there's no way that this can be real, what I saw. But what really hit the nail on the coffin was that this thing was attacking people's farm animals, and I had seen this thing by a cow farm. I haven't seen this beast again. I really don't want to because I think it's a bad omen since I have a superstitious family, which is why I think paranormal and odd occurrences happen to us. Whenever we do have odd experiences, we don't speak about it to each other. This is a long one, but this is a true and factual story about my experience. I'd like to start by saying that I'm very skeptical when it comes to things people claim are paranormal. I don't just jump to conclusions that a strange event is caused by spirits, but some things I just can't wrap my head around or explain. I won't say that what happened to me and what I experienced was from a spirit, because I don't know 100%. All I know is that I'll never touch a Ouija board again, or be around one because the experience disturbed me for the better part of a year. Also, I'd like to add that this is only one of 2 paranormal events that I've ever personally experienced that I can say 100% that I don't know what happened. Here we go, starting with the background. I used to think that Ouija boards were a load of crap. I still kind of do. I really don't know how I feel about them anymore, actually. I always saw them as a party game for gullible people, so when my friend Joe, not his real name for privacy, told me that he had one, I just laughed it off. I had only known Joe for about a year or so after meeting through mutual friends. He lived in a small apartment with his girlfriend Lisa, also not her real name, and their dog Vincent. At the time I was only 18. Joe was like 23, and Lisa was 20. For a period of time, I used to go over to their place every weekend after work because Joe bought me alcohol. So one night we were hanging out, and Joe starts talking about some strange encounters he had growing up and how he, quote-unquote, attracted spirits his whole life or some garbage. I smiled and nodded to be polite while he went off on paranormal tangents and started talking about shadow people following him. He then goes into his room and pulls out a Ouija board, but not the one that you get at a store made by a toy company. It was made of real wood and hand-carved. It was actually pretty nice. He said that he had gotten it as a birthday gift from his parents years ago because of his obsession with the paranormal. I didn't inquire as to where it had come from or who made it, but like I said, it looked handmade. While I sat there laughing and joking about it, Lisa chimes in and says, "Joe, tell him about the other night." Joe proceeds to tell me how him and Lisa allegedly spoke to a demon using it, and the demon claimed that his name was Beelzebub. Me being a big metalhead at the time, he got my attention. "Let's do it. Let's try to talk to this demon," I said, half joking. Joe asked if I was sure that I wanted to try it, and I agreed. So we went into his room. We turned off all the lights in the apartment. Lisa lit candles all around the room and we sat on the floor. I was nervous, but I was having fun watching Lisa and Joe's pageantry. It was spooky. I looked over at Joe and he seemed unsettled. I asked what was wrong, and he said that he wasn't feeling right. He didn't like the doors open displaying the darker areas of the apartment. Him and I got up and closed every door in the place. as in every room and every closet. We sat back on the floor and Vincent, the pup, laid on the bed. And we began. I forgot to add, this is very important. Before we started, I told Joe that I was skeptical of someone using their fingers to push the planchette around. So we all agreed to just use the back of our fingernails to touch it. Imagine just slightly bending your finger and placing the surface of your nail on the top. That's what we did. That way, even if you added pressure, your finger just slipped around on the planchette and didn't actually move it. We also made a rule. If the planchette moves, everyone has to lightly scratch the planchette with their nail to prove that none of us were the ones making it happen. What it looked similar to is placing your two fingers on a table and acting like they're legs and running in place. I hope that helps you get the picture. No one was able to move it on their own. We tried several times to ask if there were spirits with us, and got nothing. For about 20 minutes it continued that way. I told Joe I wanted to ask for someone in particular. Is John Smith here with us? Can John Smith talk to me? John Smith, obviously once again not his real name, was the name of my best friend's dad who was killed in a car crash while driving home from a fishing trip. That was when it moved, and it was absolutely insane. It felt like a great force just came to life in the planchette, like it had a mind of its own. None of that gliding around the board crap that you see in movies. This thing felt like we were holding onto a person's hand who was tugging and pulling. It was strong, but articulate movement, and it spelled out, hello. I asked him if he was John, and it spelled yes. I asked him to prove it, and it spelled out the name of my best friend. I asked him where he was when he passed, and he spelled Lake. I had chills down my spine. What I thought was just going to be fun had turned into being emotional and scary. Joe and Lisa knew nothing about John Smith. I never mentioned him or brought up anything about the circumstances, so they couldn't have known. I began to grow very unsettled. I told Joe and Lisa that I didn't want to talk to John anymore, so they told me to push the planchette to goodbye or whatever it was. I called it a night after that, but I wanted more. Next night, I was back. Same routine, John and Lisa set up the room, John closed all the doors, Vincent was on the bed. Lisa said that she wanted to talk to her grandma, so we did the process. It was the same incident for her as it was for me. Memory is kind of fuzzy, but it spelled out I love you, and also spelled out some sort of inside joke that she used to share with her grandmother. Lisa was in tears. As with me, I had no info on her grandma, and Joe wasn't that cruel to make her cry as a joke. I felt powerful. I think we all did. I felt like I was finally a believer, that we had an actual way of talking to spirits. The possibilities. But then it happened. After the incident with Lisa's grandma, we were all kind of in shock. Joe was comforting Lisa, and I was speechless. We regained our composure and got back to it. This time we were asking the normal, are there any spirits with us? What usually left the planchette lifeless suddenly kicked in with great force. Scary force. The planchette moved violently around the board. We all kind of laughed nervously. We asked, who are you? The planchette shot to the moon symbol. If you don't know, this allegedly means a dark spirit. We all looked at each other, and then simultaneously moved the planchette to goodbye. As soon as we did, Vincent jumped up and ran off of the bed. He sat and stared as if looking at someone. We had that door closed before. Joe jumped up and said, F this, and ran into the kitchen. Lisa and I followed. Joe about nearly had a panic attack. He rushed to turn on all the lights. I've never seen him act that way. We were all pretty scared. We don't know what happened, but we had that door closed, for sure. After some talking and calming each other down, I left. I didn't sleep that night. I had never seen anything like that. After that night, I felt like I was being followed constantly. For almost a year, I slept with the lights on. That year ended up being one of the worst years of my life. I fell into a depression and was incredibly paranoid. I just couldn't shake the feeling that something was always watching me. I continued to go to Joe and Lisa's place occasionally, but we never touched the board again. We ended up having a falling out some months later over unrelated drama and never communicated after that. Like I said, that year was horrible for me. I started drinking a lot and tried to get over the feeling. I always felt like my energy was being sapped, like the air was heavy, and I struggled to find joy. The depression was real. Then the experience hit a peak. I was sleeping one night and woke up in a panic. I couldn't breathe. I felt as if someone was literally sitting on my chest. I gasped for air. Suddenly, I felt like what was someone grabbing my feet and trying to pull me off of my bed. I instantly went into a struggle, trying to kick out as hard as I could. Then all at once, it stopped. I was horrified. Nobody was in my room. I lost even more sleep after that incident. I ended up finally getting a hold on my life. I started going to the gym instead of drinking and wallowing in my pity. I started meditating instead of playing video games. After that year, it all went away. It was like I was free from that negative energy again, and I have been fine ever since. That's the story of my Ouija board experience. I'm still not sure if all of it was in my head, or if that night was just some sort of stress-induced panic attack, but whatever it was, I cannot explain it. People have told me that demons thrive off your energy, and that is what might have happened, but I'm just not sure. Perhaps it was the demon talking to us all along, pretending to be our loved ones, if such a thing exists. I'm just glad that whole experience is in my past. I'll never touch a Ouija board again, though. This happened about 9 years ago. My mom had made this friend who claimed to be psychic. I've never really believed that she was, but that's a completely different story to tell. Anyway, she said that she enjoyed going ghost hunting. Mind you, this is when Ghost Hunters was a pretty popular show, and my mom, sisters, and I decided that it would be fun. We didn't have the special equipment that they had, but we did have a video camera and a voice recorder. We were good to go. We visited several cemeteries that summer and got some pretty awesome footage, which I can share later. This one has always stuck with me. So, in doing research on where we should go next, I found a post about the cemetery in Lafayette, Colorado. It said supposedly that a vampire was buried there. The post said that some people believed this because he was from Transylvania, and a tree grew right up through the middle of the grave where they said his heart would have been. We decided to go. About 3 hours later, we showed up at this cemetery that looks more like a park. We get out of the car and begin walking into the cemetery, looking through all the headstones. Not very far into our walk, we come to the vampire's resting place. The headstone is a plain slab of concrete with a line down the middle and the name of the man, when he died, and where he was from. My sister, toting the video camera, comes walking up next to me and says, "So this is your stake, huh?" We didn't hear anything weird, and continued to walk around after that. The cemetery was pretty mild in comparison to the others that we had been to. The feelings weren't overbearing or scary. Suddenly, Sandy comes running toward us, whispering frantically, we have to leave right now, they're coming." She's the psychic one. Anyway, we start rushing back to the car, and suddenly these police officers on bikes come riding up. They gave us a warning, saying that the park was officially closed for the evening, but that we could visit during the day. We drove home and plugged in the camera to check the footage. We got to the part where Elizabeth had asked, "So this is your steak, huh?" A reply immediately came saying, "Yes, my steak." We went back several times to make sure that we weren't imagining it, but every single one of us heard those words. Skip forward a few years. I was taking my mom to the dentist, and when we got there in the waiting room, there was a book of the most haunted places in Colorado. Well, of course it piqued my interest. During her visit, I scanned the book, and about halfway through, I came to the page about the Lafayette vampire. The crew who investigated his grave had asked a similar question to Elizabeth's, and the response that they got, wait for it, "Yes, my steak." I started laughing. We were so sure that we had imagined it because we had wanted to hear it. But there's no imagining two separate groups of people who got the same exact response. If you ever get to Lafayette, Colorado, check it out. The cemetery isn't a scary or overly creepy one, but the response that you get from the vampire is real. The man or men in the grave weren't actually vampires. They were mine workers. And if I remember correctly, they died of the 1918 Spanish flu. They were poor and didn't have the money to send their bodies back to their homes for burial, so they are buried here. I hope you enjoy this one as much as I have for the last several years. It's definitely one moment or two that I will never forget. This happened to my dad, who told me this story when I accidentally discovered a Ouija board in a closet in our house. He was living in Spain at the time, and during the 1970s, he bought that Ouija board. He told me that one day he talked too much with a wise entity who responded to everything so clearly and philosophically. The thing is, my dad asked it, "Where are you?" And the board started to mark random numbers and letters such as 1652AC, 8820, that kind of thing. My dad, who was consternated, thought that it was decontextualized. Nonetheless, and he cannot explain why, he wrote down the entire random series of numbers. And he cannot explain why, he wrote down the entire random series of numbers and letters on a paper that he had left sitting on a shelf. The disturbing part after that is that a few years during the 1980s, later, my dad was watching Cosmos with Carl Sagan, and he told me that in that show, Sagan explained that scientists had discovered a new galaxy that was called with a sequence of numbers and letters. My dad was so impressed, so he copied down the name of the show and he looked for the paper on the shelf. And yes, it was the same sequence. My dad is fascinated with this experience and told me that the Ouija is not just spiritual, it is also interdimensional. When he told me, I was between scared and curious, and I considered aliens using the Ouija board. He still believes that this wise entity is up there somewhere, talking with others. When I was growing up, there had been a few forests around town that had famous stories linked to them. The people believed that the forests were cursed from the Native American tribes who were relocated from their homes way back when. They said that the forests belong to them, and when you go in and ignore your gut feeling, those people die in those woods. When my dad and my sister and I moved when I was around 13 or so, we moved to a small town. Across the street was a hill, and at the top stood a blue water tower. I used to hang out in the woods across the street from my house. It was quiet, and the birds always chirped. Other kids were scared of the woods, but I went up there to draw and listen to the birds. Also, because it was at the top of a hill, I could look out and see the entire town and feel the breeze. But when the animals went quiet, it was time to go. When the school year started, I found out that it was an ancient Indian burial ground. Every year our class would go up the hill and learn about it, and the town and the school was actually really respectful of the forest and the hill. We took care of the trees there. If you looked at the ground, you could still see a lot of Native American arrowheads. We never took them home, though, and were not supposed to. I didn't, at least. I would actually go into the forest when I was walking home because the bullies were too scared to go in. I felt safe there, but I also had to remember to respect it. In the forest, we also had wood piles. When we would go into the forest, we would make piles for the local foxes to nest in during the winter time. Once I went to school after retreating into the forest from one of my bullies the other day. A couple of my classmates ran up to me and said, "What did you do, Jacob?" I looked at the kid and said, "Nothing, why?" They looked at each other and said, "Well, something scared him, and we thought you had scared him, in the woods." I said, "I didn't scare him, I just went in there to hang out." It was the time that Jacob threw a rock at me, and I remember it landed to my right, and I hurried up my pace in the woods, and I thought that he had left at that point, like he always did. He screamed "raccoon" at me, and when I reached the top of the hill, I cried and went home because for some reason that time the bullying hurt. Whatever happened to Jacob in the woods, I'll never know. He stopped bullying me from that day forward and said sorry to me and that it would never happen again. He did say something happened in the woods, but he never said by what or who. Just had a look of terror and practically begged me to accept his apology. I told him it's all right and I went on my way. He could never look me in the eye again. That was back in middle school. When I went to college, I saw him at a 4th of July college event. I was going to catch up with him about life and put the bullying behind us. He glanced, but still looked so uneasy that I simply walked by. Also, sometimes my sister would walk home with me after school. Only once or twice that I can recall. Every time we entered the woods, she felt lost. I even had her lead us, and she couldn't follow the trail. It's like she kept seeing these invisible trails that went in circles. She started to breathe heavy and cry and said we were lost, and she had an anxiety attack and just told me that we had to get out of the woods. I was totally chill, and knew the forest pretty well, and I let us out, and it was easy. It was literally just 3 trails, one from the south, one from the north, and one going up the hill to our house. You could get in and out of the forest in under 10 minutes, from one side to the other. This happened in 2011. Back then I was very engaged in political activism, and I ended up organizing an Occupy movement in the city I was living in, along with some other fellows. We camped in a downtown square for about 4 months, and throughout this period a lot of people came in and out. By the 2nd month I had to travel to another city where my parents were living for a week. When I came back to the occupation, there was a guy living there that had arrived exactly when I had left. He had somehow already had some respect from other people in a very short period of time. He was tall, blonde, long hair, a bit hippie, had a profound voice that implied self-confidence. He had by some means a strange aura. But okay, no big deal, seemed like a cool guy after a while. Over time he became my friend, and we ended up having long conversations about pretty much everything that interested me and vice versa, like occultism, magic, UFOs, etc., until he brought up the vampirism subject, which I was not familiar with at the time. He explained to me some stuff like that vampires were basically normal people that could manage their own life force, and apparently they have been misinterpreted since always. He told me that there were some secret vampire groups, small ones, that preserved the rituals. There was no blood-sucking thing going on, as he said that blood was an analogy to life force. They were not actually sucking it from people, but they could indeed take somebody's life force. But more important, he said, was to know how to use your own. The conversation finished there. The whole thing seemed fascinating to me, and after a while, we went to sleep. Some days later, here's what happened. My house was quite close to the occupation, and once in a while some of my friends would often ask me to use the bathroom or to have a shower, and then this guy asked me the same. I said yes, no problem at all. Everything went fine, the guy had his shower, and we were walking back to the occupation, and he brought up the subject about vampirism again. This time he was wearing an anonymous plastic mask, which completely covered his face. He starts to explain to me how one can control their own life force inside dreams, and how would that affect the actual material body. Meanwhile, as he's explaining that, I see his jaw making a strange movement, as if there was something stuck between his teeth, and he was trying to clean it. When he finishes the explanation, he calls me by my name and raises the mask slightly so I can take a look at his mouth. And then I saw this huge canine tooth. He pulled the mask back down quickly. I didn't know how to react, so I just remained calm and I asked him what was that for if they didn't actually suck blood from other people. He told me that it worked out as a sort of antenna to capture different vibrations, and he managed to construct it by molding his life force into that shape inside his dreams. He asked me if I would be interested in doing the same. I told him that it sounded interesting, and he just left me to think about it. We arrived at the occupation as if nothing had happened. I didn't see any strange movements by his hands trying to insert a fake tooth into his mouth, or trying to remove it after. The sensation I got was that he pulled the tooth out by a jaw movement. The whole thing was just very strange to digest. I had no idea what to do, so I called my friend and he just said that the whole story sounded too crazy to be believable. We still lived together in the occupation for a while, but I never brought up the subject again. The guide totally noticed my attempt to avoid it, so he didn't push me on it either. There was another strange fact after a while. Once he was shirtless, and crouched organizing some stuff inside of his tent, and the muscles on his back formed into the shape of a winged dragon. The occupation eventually finished, and that guy ended up dating a girl that he met there, and they both had a kid together. He seemed pretty normal, despite those 2 occasions. Recently I moved into a new house. 2 close friends, let's call them E and R, moved in along with me. When we went to view the house, nothing seemed off about it. However, about a week in, we screwed up. E had been cleaning out the attic and came across a wooden box. It looked fairly new and we didn't think anything could ever go wrong with it. E and I looked inside the box. All that was there was 4 candles, an old matchbox with no matches, and a small wooden doll. E and I set it aside, not interested. We ended up putting it back in the attic, apart from the doll, which R wanted to put in her potted plant. We proceeded with our sorting and forgot all about the box. That night, when I went to bed, I felt as if I were being watched. It was unnerving, but I eventually fell asleep. A few hours later, I heard something bang against the floor above me. I would have brushed it off as E, as his room was up there, if what had happened next didn't take place. For a bit of background knowledge, in September of 2017, R was in a car crash. The others were fine, but R ended up in a wheelchair. R called out for me. It wasn't calm as it usually was, but frantic. I moved into her room, and she asked me if I had heard the crash. I told her I had and thought that it was just E. She looked me dead in the eye and told me that E was working a night shift. It was unlike her to be so flustered, so I offered to stay with her, which she accepted. Soon after, we began to hear light footsteps and giggles outside R's room. We were scared, but continued to try and tune it out. R fell asleep, but I stayed with her, scared shitless by possible ghost children. Eventually, the stupid undead kids stopped running up and down the halls, so I assumed they left. I was then able to fall into a well-deserved slumber. Then, maybe an hour or so later, E got back from work. I know this because he is incapable of entering anywhere quietly. And then he screamed, like a grown man screaming as if he were a little girl. He ran up the stairs into my room and then out of my room because I was with R, and then he ran into R's room. He then told us what had happened. Apparently, he'd been putting his work bag down and felt as if he were being watched. He looked up and for a split second saw a little boy and girl holding hands. Now, normally I wouldn't have believed anything like this, but he is an honest bloke, and I saw the look of terror on his face. This happened to me a few months ago. I woke up in the middle of the night. I was on my back, and there was a man standing at the foot of my bed, staring at me. He was wearing black. He looked very calm. I think he was floating because he was high up in the air. I have always been freaked out about ghosts, but for some reason I did not panic, and I just stared back at him for a few seconds. After he seemed to realize that I was awake, he was surprised and appeared nervous. He then turned away as if he was leaving and disappeared. I never had any experiences with sleep paralysis, so I don't think that this was the reason that this happened. Also, my dog was sleeping next to me, and she did not wake up. Even after he left, I was not afraid. I truly do not understand why. While going through a tough time in my relationship, I decided to move in with my mom for a few months for a break from the chaos. A guy I had met through a mutual friend of ours offered to pick me up in his truck and take us for a drive through the mountain trails behind my mother's house. Bored out of my mind with TV and food, I agreed. He arrived, I got in, we drove to the top of the ridge at the beginning of one of the trails where we stopped to roll up really quick. 5 or 10 minutes later, we were slowly driving along, listening to music, talking, laughing, realizing that we had actually been neighbors years before. The song on the truck radio was changing, and there began a softer song. We could hear the wind blowing quietly through the trees, and all of a sudden there was a whisper. "She's with him," the voice said, extremely clearly. I did not know what to do. I mean, what were they talking about? And even more importantly, who were they? We continued to drive down a trail a bit longer because my guy friend said it would be bad not to show dominance to whatever it was and not to run scared, ever. But it was, in fact, the scariest moment of my life. I should clarify also that this is in the middle of nowhere in the middle of nowhere. My mom has no neighbors for miles. Hunters are allowed on the property, but none were in the area. We shined headlights in the direction of the whisper, and there was nothing. There's this large section of southwest Austin, Texas that used to be known as the Eanes Marshall Ranch. There's a story to be found about a man who was murdered by bandits, and his body was buried in an unmarked grave on the side of the dirt road after being discovered by the ranch owner. Eventually, the body was found by police over 100 years later while searching for evidence of deer poaching. Thus, a local ghost story was reinvigorated and spread to a new generation. When I was in high school, my friends and I got it in our heads to go out there and do some ghost hunting before the house was torn down to make way for a church. We took a couple of disposable film cameras, along with a Ouija board, and headed out under the cover of dark. We got there a little after 11 p.m. We hung around for several hours taking photos of nothing, literally pointing the cameras into the darkness and saying, "May I please take your picture?" Click. We had a no smoking rule, and we were not using the flash for the outside shots. We made our way back inside the main house. The smallest member of the group shimmied through an unsecured window in a small side room and opened a door for the rest of us. We took some photos inside with the flash on. My friends spent a good bit of time on the Ouija board. I declined to participate in that part and went outside. They came out and claimed to have contacted an entity through the Ouija board. I was like, okay, sure. We left after all the film was spent, and we got bored with it. We never did hear the legendary wagon or horses that supposedly come through. Nothing spooky happened at all while we were there. The next day, the cameras were dropped off at Eckerd's to be sent off for development. A few days later, the rolls came back with a lot of black nothing, which was to be expected when taking photos outside at night with no flash. There were a few shots that were taken inside the house while using a flash that had some things that you might call orbs, but those could be explained away as dust or bugs. However, the photo I'm talking about still sends chills down my spine every time I see it. We were very strict about not using the flash outside and not smoking, as I said. We wanted to have our best chance at capturing something like this without having a seed of doubt that it could have been a trick of the light or of the camera. Two of my friends who took part in the Ouija session had several unexplained glass-breaking incidents. They said it happened whenever they were talking about the entity or said its name. They were sitting in the car while parked when the passenger window formed spiderweb cracks like a rock had hit it, but no impact was heard. A few days later, glass cups fell out of their kitchen cabinets, no fronts, just open shelves, when no one was in the kitchen and all the cats were in the living room with them. More than a few of their picture frames had the glass shatter while still hanging on the wall. When they stopped mentioning the entity's name, the activity calmed down and eventually stopped. So this happened a few months back, when I happened to be in the bathroom. I was singing that Willow Smith "Wait a Minute" song to myself, minding my business, you know. I got to the point in the song where she quotes a phrase said in the Avatar movie in their language. And while I'm singing it, I'm thinking to myself at the same time, I wonder what that actually means translated into English. And as I finished singing the line, simultaneously trying to recall what it translated to, a female, disembodied voice said, "No, you can't." I shut up immediately and paused for a second, shocked. It sounded as if someone were speaking into a tin can, but very clear and only a few feet away. I left the bathroom completely weirded out, and after a few minutes I remembered about wanting to know what the phrase meant. I Googled it and found out that it meant "I see you" in English. I was, and am, still blown away by this strange experience. I will preface this by saying that I think I'm silly to believe in ghosts, and I get embarrassed to speak about it. The alternative to believing that I was haunted is admitting that I am much more mentally ill than I had ever believed, which is absolutely possible. This took place over a few years in a farmhouse in the desert of Arizona. It was newly developed land. We moved into the place when I was 15. At the time, I was going through a lot emotionally and smoking a lot of weed. That might explain some of my personal experiences, so I'll try not to dwell on them too much. The house was set up almost plantation style. It was very wide, had a big wraparound porch, and lots of awkward corners. The front room was a tall library with an open balcony to the upstairs, which ran into long, skinny bedrooms. My parents' room was closest to the stairs and was attached to a nursery with a sliding ensuite door. My brother's rooms, who were 2 years younger than me, and my room were at the end of a dark hallway. That side of the house never got sun, so it had bad vibes all around. Downstairs, there was a messed up Harry Potter-style closet, a sunken-in living room, a kitchen in the center of the house, and a sunken playroom for the baby. It honestly started the first day that we moved in. My brother and I were the only ones in the house, and we were unboxing plates. It was so empty that everything in there echoed. I swear it sounded like a little girl laughed, like a creepy track that you could get off of an app or something. Keep in mind, the TVs were not plugged in. We were on an acre of land, far away from the dirt road, and my brother was way too stupid to pull a prank like that. I started hearing voices at night. This wasn't unusual. I honestly used to freak myself out so badly that I think I made noises up to scare myself. My parents had raised me not to talk about things scaring me, to tough it out and be a big girl. It was fine most of the time during the day. Everything bad came at night. I remember distinctly when it started messing with me in bed. In solidarity, my brother and I kept our bedroom doors open for the hallway's nightlight, and in case we needed to call for each other. We had a pretty messed up childhood that might have contributed to all the codependency I'll describe during this. I was falling asleep, but not quite out. I felt the blanket slipping off the bed and reached down to grab it. This was common. I didn't have a bed frame with a foot. It kept slipping no matter how I tried to tuck it. In classic horror movie fashion, the last time I pulled it, I felt tension. There was nothing it could have been caught on. I felt like the second I went from confused to terrified, it bounced back to me. I don't know how to explain this that well, but I was certain that someone was under the bed pulling it away from me. Later, I moved another nightlight into the bedroom. It was a kind of spooky amber orange, and I convinced my parents to let me paint the walls cherry red. Again, I was almost asleep, but not quite out, so I don't think it could have been sleep paralysis. I heard the carpet rustle, and maybe joints cracking. It sounded like my mom had come in to check on me. I opened my eyes, and immediately froze. I don't think I've ever been more scared in my life. There was a woman crawling across my floor from the far side of my room to the foot of my bed. She was pale and stringy-haired as if she were going bald. I couldn't see her face. I don't know how I fell asleep. I couldn't scream or move. I think she disappeared under my bed. But again, this could always be a hallucination. My baby brother was about 7 months old when she started coming out during the day. My mom was a teacher at the time and was able to stay home with us during summer vacation. It was lunchtime and we were watching a movie quietly downstairs while the baby napped. There were noises upstairs, as if something had been dropped to the ground. We listened for a second before my mom ran up. She thought the baby had fallen out of his crib. We opened the door and found him sound asleep. There was weird white stuff on the floor. It took us a while to figure out that it was drywall or something like that. There was a crawl space to a small attic where the AC and insulation could be reached. It was barely big enough to get into and a good 9 feet from the ground. It also had to be pushed up and slid over to open. There was a visible gap. The carpet was a really ugly dark blue, so we could see the white spots on the ground as if something had been dragged from one side of the room to where the crib was, and it stopped right in front of it. My mom checked the closet and called my stepdad. He couldn't leave work, so he stayed downstairs until he got home and checked the crawl space. We have never had animals. It's really difficult for most things to live in Arizona, so wildlife is pretty rare in that area. He didn't find anything, or signs of anything living up there. This happened every other day for 2 weeks. We really didn't know what to make of it. My mom thought it might be the AC suctioning the opening upward. It stopped and didn't happen again for 2.5 years, until my baby sister was born and stayed in the same crib. Again, it happened on and off for a few weeks, and never again. To keep my own solo experiences brief, I had a period of 3 months where I straight up did not sleep. I went crazy. Every night, I felt like my bed was shaking. The instant I laid my head down, it would vibrate, the metal frame would sway, and I would feel as if something was pushing the mattress between the baseboards or sitting on the corner. I had my brother touch the frame one night to tell me if the shaking was in my head or not. He said it wasn't, but I'm still not sure if he wasn't just playing into it. I thought I might be having seizures or something. At one point I got so frustrated I started sleeping on the couch downstairs with the dog. I started hearing whispers too. Not a noise that sounded odd, but someone calling my name. My name has 3 freaking syllables. I would be in my room, door open, doing something at night after my parents went to bed. It was a female voice, but it sounded off. I don't know how to explain it. The downstairs really scared me after the lights went out, so I never went down, but I did walk to the balcony and look. I never saw anything, but the whispering would stop when I got close. My brother started hearing it too. He's kind of weird. His life's dream has been enlisting in the army, so his reaction was always getting his knife and walking right downstairs to confront it. He would turn the lights on and look around before coming right back up. He slept on my floor a few nights because he was convinced that she wanted me. We had prior haunting experiences, which led to my parents making jokes that the ghosts follow us. They didn't pay much attention to it at the time when it was quiet. One night my parents went out with the babies. My brother and I were in our rooms, doors open per usual. We started hearing something strange. At first, I thought it was the wind. It got louder until it was clear that a woman was wailing. I know it sounds crazy, but it was so clear. We hid in my room for what felt like hours, calling my mom. For some reason, it never occurred to us to call the police. Eventually, the crying stopped. We hatched a plan to run for the stairs and out the nearest door. All of the lights were on in the house, and my brother has his stupid knives. It's like it knew that we were going to leave. We heard shuffling outside the door, and maybe breathing? I guess it could have been the air conditioning. We kind of decided that we were ready to die, unlocked the door, and booked it. The crying started again, and it was very clear that it was coming from my parents' room. We stood outside the property line for another hour, waiting for them to arrive, watching the house. No one could have gotten out without us seeing. We had huge windows lining the upstairs hallway that showed everything with the lights on. My parents again made fun of us, and still do about that night. A few other incidents include my baby brother talking to the man upstairs. He would stand in front of the balcony and chat up to someone. He told us that the man was hiding in my room. He talked about the man in the window and would ask, "Who's that?" directed to the doors at night. I don't want to talk about all of it, but there were so many instances of voices, doors slamming, and things being knocked over in my room that I really did think I was losing my mind. I moved out at 18 and came back occasionally, usually to babysit. Apparently, my reluctant believer mother and absolute skeptic stepdad watched a coffee pot jump off of the counter. They were also outside sitting and having an open fire while drinking a coffee when they saw a figure in the balcony window of our room. It was a tall man, but my stepdad still needed urging to go upstairs. It appeared a second time, closer to where the nursery door was. My mom said she had horrible dreams about a man in the corner of her room after that. She was present for many of the instances where we heard footsteps upstairs, doors slamming when the AC was off, etc., but she always denied that there was anything wrong. Once my parents left town with the kids for a week. At this point I was 19 and living happily an hour away. My mom begged me to check on my brother and stay a few nights for the weekend. I arrived during the evening after I got off of work. I asked how had things been when he was alone. He said he was fine, he just didn't go upstairs at night and, quote-unquote, minded his business. He said if he ignored it and tried not to get scared, then it, in return, ignored him. He felt safe with the dog. We were watching YouTube and eating when we started to hear a deep noise. At first, I thought it was a bike or one of the small buggies that people drove out here. Then, I noticed that it was holding a tune. It was humming. The dog had a weird thing about staring into the bathroom if the door was open, which is scary at night. This time, the door was closed, and he still stood up and stared. The noise was so deep that it sounded as if it couldn't have been human, but it was definitely melodic. There's nothing I could think to figure out to try and explain it. My brother and I just kind of looked at each other. Then, a door slammed upstairs, and we decided to nope out of there and go for a walk. When we got back, I decided that I would sleep in my parents' room. It didn't feel right to stay in the kids' room, but looking back, it would have been best to stay close to my brother. I fell asleep surprisingly easy. I guess about 2 hours passed before my brother slammed the door open. The house smelled like it was burning. Not really like a fire smell, but more like burning plastic and trash. I was panicked. I was the adult and had no idea what to do in that situation. We checked the house. I turned off the air conditioning, thinking it might be on fire. We opened all the windows and fell asleep on the couches downstairs. The next day, the smell was still lingering, but less overwhelming. The air conditioner was fine when I turned it back on. Like usual, the day was fine. That next night, my brother and I went on a jack-in-the-box run. It might have taken 30 minutes. We arrived home to a mess of blood, vomit, and shit. The dog was sick all over the living room. We immediately took him to an emergency vet, certain that he was dying. They checked him for everything that they could and gave him a clean bill. When we got home, all hell broke loose. My brother and I were cleaning up the mess with the doors open for airflow. There were absolutely insane banging noises coming from upstairs. We hadn't locked up on the way out. My brother thought that someone had snuck in and was trashing the place. He went up to check, and I hung out downstairs ready to call the cops if need be. Nothing happened. Nothing even seemed out of place. We kept cleaning, but the noise started almost immediately. It kind of sounded like someone was shouting behind a wall of cement. I couldn't tell the gender. My brother told me he had been fine until I got there, that I could leave if I wanted. I totally did, and I didn't go back. My parents sold the house this year. During the interim of the move, they stayed in an Airbnb. My brother lived really close to his work, so he stayed in the house with the dog for a few weeks. This story is just his own, so I'm not sure if I believe it. Like I said, he's kind of strange, but he's also not really one to embellish. He had been hearing the usual things, even his name being called in the night, but ignored all of it. His friends had been coming over to keep him company. The last day he was supposed to finish moving, he brought another friend. He says he felt that they were being watched the whole time when they cleared the place out, and his friend left him to lock up. They got into the car facing the house when they noticed that the blinds were open. They were definitely closed on the way out. His friend claims that he saw them open from the corner of his eye. My brother says that there is a woman squatting in front of a downstairs window, close to where he had just left from. She was pale, her nose was hooked, and her hair was black and stringy. Again, classic horror movie ghost. He said she had black eyes with visible white dots in the centers. Inside-out eyes, as he called them. And she was smiling. He says it took him a second of shock to realize that she was looking directly at him. He felt sick, like she could walk right out and get him. They burned rubber when his friend snapped out of it, and they screamed at each other all the way down the road about what they saw. He called me right after to explain it, but I was with my own friends and not really willing to listen at the time. What messes me up is that my mom thought he had a psychotic break. He went into his room and cried all night at the Airbnb. She thought something had happened with his girlfriend. My brother is not a crier. I haven't seen him do that since we were little. When we got together and talked about it, his eyes teared up then, too. He said he didn't know why, but he knew that she wanted to kill him. He drew a picture of her. It's not great, but it still fills me with the deepest foreboding. It took me a while to realize that I saw her too, just once in my bedroom almost 5 years ago. Suddenly it made sense. I knew it didn't feel like a woman, but it felt feminine, like something pretending to be a woman. My ex brought this up today. We dated all through high school and had a few experiences together that she recounts as her only paranormal encounters. I would love to still think that this was my own delusion, but it was shared by way too many people. Maybe a few things can be explained, but most of it truly can't. It has affected me so deeply that I'm still terrified that if I think too much about her, she'll follow us a state away. One early summer morning in 2000, I got up and ready to drive my mom to her job at a local retirement home. It was dark starting out, but the sun was gradually coming up. I dropped her off and started returning to her house. Halfway back, driving on a country road densely populated with trees and houses, I noticed a car coming because I could see its high-beaming lights from a short distance. I also saw a large, jet-black dog in my path, standing completely still with its head pointed forward. It had a slender build. Having only a few seconds to think, I decided to continue forward and brace for the impact from running into its body. I closed my eyes as I got the closest to it, and continued to drive without swerving, and to my surprise, I felt nothing. I slowed down to check for the dog, but there was absolutely nothing back there. As I continued my drive, I felt strange because there was no way that I would have missed that animal. It was not facing me. It was facing right. I would have struck it broadside. Anyway, I'm thankful I didn't swerve. I feel like had I swerved, things would have been very much different for me today. I do believe that I could have died. A few nights ago, I awoke to being restrained by what I can only describe as a vampire. I'm familiar with the paranormal, but this was a particularly impressive experience. I was pinned to my bed, trapped underneath the body of a young woman. It was as if she was trying to bite me, but at the same time doing everything in her power to stop herself. Or she was doing her best to bite me, but something was preventing her from being able to. She was struggling and jerking, breathing rapidly and kind of growling and snorting. The way she was moving, it was almost as if she was on fast forward. Her teeth were grazing my neck with her mouth wide open. I could feel them against my skin, but was sure that they never penetrated. I was unable to break free and struggled in fear, but realized that I couldn't get away, so just gave in and embraced her. When I embraced her, I found that I actually felt an overwhelming love, despite the disturbing nature of the experience. I had a very clear image of what she looked like. She had long, wavy hair, and somehow resembled myself. I could also feel her intention. Even though she was doing something violent, it was clear to me that she was good at heart. Eventually, because I was alternatively struggling against her, I did break free, and she disappeared. I had a similar experience to this around a year ago where I awoke to a dark, humanoid shadow being standing beside me, manipulating my energy. That being, however, I felt was inherently evil. This vampiric entity, on the other hand, didn't give off a sinister vibe. It just seemed to me that she was trapped in some kind of karma, unable to control herself. I know about the sleep paralysis demon phenomenon, and that there is supposed to be logical explanation for these occurrences. Honestly, I completely disbelieved in anything supernatural for most of my life. After everything I've experienced, though, it's impossible to deny that these kinds of things are real. In 2011, my older cousin bought a small, 2-bedroom, single house in a quiet neighborhood for retired folks. The house was very small, with only 850 square feet of interior space, but it sat on a large plot of land. We could have easily fit 2 more houses like it on that lot, and still would have nice leftover space for yards and gardening. I was still a college student at that time, and I lived with my cousin. When he bought the house, I moved in with him. There were the 2 of us living there. According to the real estate agent, the house had been abandoned for around 3 years. The previous owner basically left it unmaintained and moved to a different state. The house had 1 main floor, a small attic, and an unfinished basement. The first time we walked in, the floorboards were already rotted out. We could see the basement through them. Everything was in horrible condition, and we would have to do major restoration to make it livable again. The property also had a small storage shed in the back of the lot. My cousin got a great offer, so he took the deal without much hesitation. Weird things started to happen when we began our restoration work. One day we were working on the bathroom. My cousin told me that he had to go to Home Depot for some stuff, and so he left. I heard him open the door, go outside, close it, turn on his car, and drive away. I was taking apart the old boards that were nailed on the bathroom walls. My back was facing the bathroom door. 5 minutes after my cousin left, the bathroom door, which was open, started to slowly move to the closed position. I knew this because I could hear the creaky old door sound that it made. I turned around and saw the door continue to close on its own. Then it stopped just as it touched the door frame and bounced back a little. I thought maybe it's just the wind. Then, suddenly the door pulled itself shut tightly, as if there was someone on the other side of the door. It happened right in front of me. I was only 4 feet away. No wind could have done that. Plus, all the windows were closed around the house, so there couldn't possibly be any form of breeze. You might think that maybe the AC caused it, but no. This old house did not have central AC. We had to put in window AC units afterward. At this point, I thought my cousin was messing with me, so I called out to him, but there was no response. Just silence. I opened the door, continued to call for him, telling him to stop playing around. But my cousin was not there. I checked the parking lot, and he was, in fact, gone. I even got outside and did a perimeter check, but no one was there, and I still cannot explain what happened. After the restoration was done, we moved in. My cousin sometimes went on business trips for weeks, and there would just be me in the house. The following happened whenever I was alone. One night I was studying and had my headphones on. I heard sounds of someone walking around in the basement, which was directly below my bedroom. It sounded like they had slippers on, and I could hear the sound of them dragging on the concrete floor with each step. What's weird was that I could not pinpoint exactly which direction in which it was coming from. It's a strange sensation when the sounds were coming from the back of my head, as if they were just right behind me. The only reason that made me think that it's the basement was because the basement was the only area in the house that had concrete and that could have made the concrete slipper dragging sound. So I took out my headphones, and the sounds of the footsteps still went on. The volume of the sounds stayed the same with or without the headphones. I thought my cousin had come home early, so I called out to him and got no reply. I took the flashlight and went to the basement to check it out. It was dark and quiet. No one else was there. This happened 3 or 4 more times within the first 2 months that I lived in that house. After that, I didn't experience anything unusual anymore. My cousin never felt or saw anything weird, but he seemed interested in my stories. His girlfriend, now wife, who had been to the house every other week or so, also expressed her uneasy feelings during her stays. By 2016, during a thunderstorm, the thunder struck our storage shed in the backyard and burned everything inside it. Luckily, the house was untouched. I came home from work only to find a police officer waiting at the front. He told me what had happened and said that it was an act of God and that our insurance would compensate for the loss. In our Asian culture, people say that when thunder strikes somewhere, often it is to strike down a malevolent force or spirit. We quickly formed the realization that this thunder strike was more than just an accident. I got my own place and moved out a few months after the fire. My cousin bought another house with his wife a year after that. He still owns the creepy house, and it's been left unoccupied since 2017. He plans to tear down the old house and build a larger one to take advantage of the large plot of land. The experiences at this house were the closest I've got to what could be considered paranormal. So much can happen in the forest. There are wild animals, possibly bad people, and the unknown itself. While hiking in Switzerland, I decided to see Matterhorn, the famous mountain, up close. As close as I could. So I left the village I was staying in early and walked through meadows, hills, and then up the mountains to reach the plateau. Early in the morning, after just leaving the town, I walked the straight path, past some houses on the left, town behind, mountain ahead, and forest on the right. In front of the forest, there were a few curious old huts on long legs, ones that you climb up to by ladder. They were all made of round planks and black soot. My imagination immediately called them witch huts, relating them to movies and legends that I knew. They seemed closed, and I couldn't get into any of them, but I felt a slight shiver of excitement, and didn't really want to get in. So I kept on walking. I saw the mountain, met some people, had lunch, and in the afternoon decided to walk back to town. I remembered the way and backtracked pretty much exactly. On my way back, the mountain was behind me, the town ahead, houses and meadows on the right, and black spooky huts on the left, guiding the entrance, a path leading into the forest. I should note that despite checking out the huts in the morning, I didn't notice that there was a forest path starting behind them. Curious about it, I checked the wooden road signs placed in the vicinity of the huts. To my surprise, the one pointing into the woods said Zermatt, but the one pointing to where I originally came from in the morning said some other town's name. I was very confused. I looked back and looked again, thinking that maybe my brain was tricking me, but I kept seeing what I saw. I stood there while a few hikers passed in each direction. All stayed on the mountain path, nobody went into the forest or looked at the road signs. I sat there in front of the huts and smoked a cigarette. I debated whether or not I should go into the forest, why the signs showed such weird directions. I wondered if there was a reason I should go in. But I was already very tired to the point of my legs feeling weak. So I decided to go back the way I came, to trust my gut and take the most common main path back to town. When I stood up, the signs were different again. There was no way anyone could have rearranged them. No wind or human. I was there the whole time, and the only people who walked by didn't stop at the signs, let alone tinker with them. The one pointing into the forest said some other name, and the one pointing to my starting point said Zermatt like it should. I told this story to my friend in Zermatt, and he just laughed at the idea of paranormal entities trying to lure me into the forest. I did have a creepy feeling about the huts. But at the same time, it was a beautiful day, and I still wonder whether there was some kind of adventure waiting for me if I took the forest path. What do you think? I had just moved into a new place, and I was living alone. I bought a Ouija board and played with it my first night there by myself. Nothing really happened, so I stashed it in my dresser under some old jeans and forgot about it. A few weeks later I was having a party and suggested that we all play with it. Everyone agreed. I went to get it, but it wasn't there. I was dumbfounded. I'm pretty tidy. I know where I put it, but I could not find it. I couldn't explain it, so I just said that I had misplaced it. I had basically forgotten about it by the next morning. Fast forward 6 months. As I'm going to bed, I lie on my stomach. I slide my arms under my pillow to get comfy. My hand hits something. It's the planchette. I have no idea how it ended up there. I threw it out, and I have never seen it again, but I fear that whatever happened with the board, and the fact that I was an edgy teen, opened something up. I was into all that black magic crap. I've done lots of rituals with seemingly no results. There's a lot more to this story. Basically, my roommates and I were terrorized in 2 separate houses by something that we cannot explain. Like it was following us. All I know is that it looked like a little girl, but I don't think that it was. I never believed in this kind of stuff, but it's hard to deny what we all experienced. For years, I've dealt with the disappearing object phenomenon, but lately, items have started appearing or reappearing as well. Just this morning, for example, I woke up and went into my kitchen to make coffee, and a random pack of paper coffee cups was sitting in the middle of my kitchen counter. No one else lives here or has access to my house, and I always set an alarm at night, so I would hear it if someone had tried to get in. I literally have no clue where this pack of coffee cups came from. It just appeared out of thin air. I'm grateful in a way, because it sure was convenient to have the cups this morning, but still, who put them there? I even checked my Amazon history to see if somehow I bought these without remembering, but no such purchase was there. I've had other objects randomly appear in my bathroom too. Lip glosses that aren't in a color that I would normally buy. I've had strange food items that I didn't buy appear in my pantry too. Boxed soups, ketchup, I don't even like it. Mustard, don't use it that much. And a random bottle of soy sauce. I don't even know what to think about this. I just had the scariest experience. I lost my ex over a year ago and had bought a Ouija board in desperation out of longing to communicate with him. I tried countless times, and it never worked, so I stored it away. Yesterday, my current boyfriend's good friend passed away. Suicide. I didn't know him very well. Today, I had a random thought to maybe try to communicate with him. I pulled out the Ouija board and asked to speak with him. It wasn't working until I closed my eyes, and then it started to move. It went to yes. I then asked it to give me a sign that it was really him. It went to the number 9. When I asked what this meant, it just kept going back to the number 9. As it's moving, I heard my cat hiss. I opened my eyes, and my cat was over the Ouija board hissing at it. My cat has hissed maybe twice in his entire life. I about pooped my pants and asked to say goodbye. I was already freaking out when I called one of my friends and they said 9 is an upside down 6. Now I am absolutely terrified. This is a story that my grandma told me, so it may not be 100% accurate, but I'll try and tell it the best that I can. More than 70 years ago, sorry for not knowing the exact timeline, my great-grandfather died of a heart attack. He was, of course, buried like any other person. Here we have a tradition that every 5 years we lift the remains of the deceased, and the family can decide if they should put the body somewhere else or leave it there. This is mostly due to the empty spaces in the graveyard if the deceased doesn't have any family. So they raised my great-grandfather's remains, but the weird thing was that he had not decomposed. He looked exactly as if he had just been buried. After 5 more years had passed, they went to lift his remains again, but this time, the coffin was empty. This is not how the story ends. 10 years after all this happened, my aunt, that was 8 at the time, was home alone one day, and she heard a strange noise in the house, so she went to investigate. In the kitchen there was a strange man who looked at her and said, "Don't be scared. I just came to see my first granddaughter." And then he disappeared. Later that day she told her parents, and after describing the man, they went to get an old photo album, and she identified my great-granddad. When my grandmother tells this story, she tends to omit the last part that my aunt told me. According to my grandmother, the priest probably sold my great-grandfather's corpse because it wasn't decomposing, and she says that my aunt is lying about having seen him. So about 15 years ago, I was living with my ex-girlfriend, my sister, and her husband in an old house not far from town. Within the first few weeks of living there, strange things were happening regularly. Lights going out randomly, noises upstairs. At one point, one of the windows at the back of the house was cut. Like someone had went in with glass cutters trying to break in, but gave up on it and left. Creepy stuff like that. That was bad enough, but things got pretty severe as time went on. One week in particular was truly insane. The first thing that happened that week was on a Tuesday night. Everyone was working, and I was home alone watching TV when I noticed that our cat was acting really weird, backed into a corner, and arched up as though she was scared. When I went to get up, the electricity went out in the house, and it was pitch black inside. The second that happened, I heard really loud footsteps running down the stairs toward me. I got up and braced myself for whatever it was, but there was nothing. I gathered myself and went outside to the front garden to check if the other houses' lights were on, but my house was the only one that was dark. I went to the fuse box to reset the trip switch, and all was back to normal. A few days later, I think it was a Tuesday, we were all sitting in the living room watching a movie and eating a pizza. The lights were on, there was a good atmosphere in the house, when out of nowhere, a massive bang happened upstairs. We go up to check it out, and I went into our bedroom and saw that my bedside table was in the middle of the room. But the worst and last thing that happened to me was on a Saturday night. I'll never forget this. It still gives me chills when I think about it. We go to bed, everything's normal. We watch a bit of a movie and fall asleep. I wake up facing the wall and glance at the alarm clock. It reads 3:13 a.m. I turned over to go back to sleep and saw my ex standing in the center of the room. Confused, I begin to sit up and ask her what's wrong. But as I start to sit up, I realize my ex is asleep in bed next to me. A surge of fear runs through my core, and I'm frozen to the spot. My eyes adjust, and I just barely make out the figure. It was a young girl in a nightdress with a cartoon character on it, soaking wet, with her head looking down at the floor. I could hear the water droplets landing on the carpet, and I'm just sitting there totally in shock, unable to believe my eyes. After a couple of seconds, her apparition melted away and faded out of sight. I got up and turned on the lights and tried to tell myself that it was just a night terror or something, but the problem with that was that there was a wet patch where she had been standing. We moved out shortly after that. But I can still picture her to this day. Creepiest thing I've ever experienced. One night when I was about 16, I walked outside onto my front porch after an argument with my mom and her husband. After about an hour of pacing and talking myself out of just leaving, the sun was setting, so I turned back and started heading back toward the house. When down the hill, about 150 yards, I see something slowly walking out of the tree line that looks to be a young woman in a dress. But the setting sun is shining off of whatever she's wearing. I don't think it's normal, and I'm a little freaked out, so I run inside and grab my binoculars. I come back, and she's only moved a few feet, walking very slowly, long steps. I focus in, and she's glowing. Gold. And she's dressed like a nun. Again, she was glowing gold. I've never seen her since, and I've spent the last 12 years searching for answers of what I witnessed that day. About 10 years ago, I moved into a new home in Indiana with 3 roommates. I won't go into too much detail about where the home is located out of respect for my former roommates, one of which still lives there. I will say that it is located in a very old part of town, a few blocks off of one of the very first main roads that used to be in the town that was settled in 1846, I believe. Anyway, this house was definitely not what comes to mind when you picture a haunted house. It was built sometime in the early 80s or early 90s. It was pretty ordinary looking. 3 bedrooms with a small loft area, tiny bathrooms, and not a whole lot of room for 4 adults to spread out. But when you're a college student in your early 20s and have the opportunity to split rent 4 ways, this seemed perfect. We had all our own tiny little spaces, shared a kitchen and living room, and spent most of our time just bullshitting around the dining room table. The house was owned by an older couple who lived in a city about 20 minutes away. They began renting the home out to help finance their retirement. They were sweet, and pretty relaxed on any rules for the home. They told us right off the bat that they were not physically fit enough to do any maintenance or repairs on the house should anything go wrong, so we were told to call them with any issues, and they would send over their handyman, or whichever professional was needed. They never came to the house. Not once. We paid rent by money order through the mail. I didn't find this strange at the time. The first weird event occurred about a week after we all moved in. We all worked the night shift at our respective jobs, so the house was empty all night and we arrived home around the same time early in the morning. We dragged ass into the living room to enjoy some sort of fast food breakfast before passing out when we realized that the entire carpet downstairs was soaked. A pipe had burst beneath our dishwasher during the night and flooded the kitchen, dining room, and living room. Our landlords had the floor replaced within a week, and we went on with our lives. Then, about a week later, we were baking cookies in the oven when all of a sudden the cookies burst into flames. The oven was producing so much heat that I was afraid that the whole thing would catch on fire. The landlord sent a repairman who told us that something had caused the internal thermometer in the oven to be so uncalibrated that you could set the oven temp to 300 degrees, but it would be more like 475 in there. Again, we had it fixed and moved on. It wasn't long after that when the unexplainable and unnerving activity began. The ceiling fans in the rooms would turn on randomly and they would spin so hard that they would rattle and shake to the point that it looked like the thing was about to fly off of the ceiling. Every room was equipped with button switches. There are 4 buttons on the wall, 1 for the light and the other 3 for various speeds for the fan. The fan would make a 2-tone chiming noise when you would push the button to turn it on. No one would be able to turn on a fan without pretty much everyone in the house hearing this chime. We were creeped out, but chalked it up to faulty wiring or a power surge. That chime still haunts my dreams. Then came the TV issue. We all pulled together to buy a large flat-screen TV for our living room, brand new, name brand, extra warranty. The TV would turn on by itself constantly. We returned it to the store, exchanging it for a new one, and thought it would be fine. We would be outside or in a different room and hear the chime, go turn the fan off, and realize that the TV had just turned itself on. This happened 5 or 6 times a day. It was unable to be ignored. 2 separate things in 2 different rooms turning on almost simultaneously. The electrician was called. He found no signs of faulty wiring, and I think he thought we were making it up. After months of this, we began to hear the whistling. 3 notes whistled by an unseen force at all times during the day. This would usually happen when you were in a room by yourself. I would get this sick, anxious feeling like I was being watched, and right then, I would hear the whistle. Someone or something wanted our attention, and he got it. 3 of us were totally convinced that our house was haunted. Our other roommate was a skeptic, and also pretty much had to make this living situation work, or he would be sleeping in his car. About 1.5 years of living in this house, dealing with constant phenomena, it ramped up again. We would be in the kitchen making dinner, go eat in the living room, and come back to find every cabinet door open. Sometimes the refrigerator and oven doors were open too. This happened probably 3 or 4 times a week, on top of all the other crap. I was over it, but had no idea how to fix it. I went to Borders bookstore and got a few books about ghosts and hauntings and different information about getting rid of the creepies in one's home. I decided to do a smudging, and I could not have been more sorry about that decision. We planned to do all the sage smudging together, and our Catholic roommate also had his priest come in and do a house blessing that same day. Holy oil and water were sprinkled in each room, the smell of white sage burning. We thought it was over. The next morning, I was walking downstairs like I had 1,000,000 times before, when my feet completely flew out from under me and I was airborne. I remember thinking, this isn't possible, right before I smashed into the stairs. I landed on my back, right at the edge of them. Picture Lucy pulling the football away before Charlie Brown can kick it, and his tiny feet are kicking in the air. I was Charlie Brown. I landed not on my butt or side, but squarely on my thoracic spine, the upper area of my spine. How on earth did I defy gravity? I had now tripped I was barefoot on carpeted stairs, sober, and holding the railing. I didn't feel a push. I felt a sweeping force take my legs out from under me. I broke 4 vertebrae in my back, about parallel with my shoulder blades. I've had injections and nerve damage and back braces and a chronic pain that isn't normal for someone in their 20s. I began to look for a new place to live. I found out that I was pregnant with my son about 2 months later, and decided that the risk was too great to live in that house pregnant, so I packed up that night, told my roommates that I would continue to pay my portion of the rent until our lease was up, and moved back in with my parents. I was only staying with my parents for about a month before finding a new safe place for my baby, my now husband, and I. But I lived constantly on edge thinking, what if it followed me? It didn't. What did follow me are the nightmares where I relive the feeling of terror and dread washing over me, and every so often, I can still hear the whistle. I live on the East Coast, so the cemeteries are ancient, mostly from the 1700s. Me and a group of friends went to a local cemetery and decided to do some light, no equipment, just our phone flashlights, ghost hunting. Nothing too eventful happened for the first half hour as we walked around the soldier memorials. We crossed an old limestone bridge with a little creek underneath. As we started to leave the memorials, I said goodbye, and people started to feel dizzy or weak in the knees with pressure in the back of their heads and upper neck. A few even felt really tired afterward. We went on a little further, and a couple of the group members decided to split off, so me and 2 others were going to the oldest section of the cemetery. A girl kept hearing her name, and kept going ahead of us. After we all regrouped and talked over everything that had happened, the other guy in the group pulled his necklace off to give it to his girlfriend and found out that it was spinning without his hand or arm moving. I personally held his arm and felt his hand. It was not moving. It spun for about a minute, then started making an X shape, and then slowly died out. After that, nothing else happened to me or my group. However, the couple said that they were hearing people calling to them from the woods, into an area without roads or any buildings for miles. Needless to say, they thought that we were playing with them. But we were on opposite sides of the cemetery entirely. Just yesterday I was talking to a girl from the group, and she said that at home she heard the same voices, plus screaming and people knocking on her door. Today I found out that she's in jail. What do I do? Should we go back to the cemetery and apologize? Or should we just forget that it happened? At first, I thought she was on drugs. But then she did something that made me wonder if she was telling the truth. I was 16. A friend and I were walking through a local park at night when we saw this Asian woman wearing what looked like a traditional Chinese dress. She was dancing alone in the grass, and she then started running toward us, scared the crap out of me, and began telling us how handsome that we were. This woman appeared to be in her mid to late 20s, and honestly she was stunningly beautiful. She kept telling us that she was a vampire, and that she was centuries old. I was thinking, okay, she's obviously on something or she's crazy. But then she gazes into my eyes and says, "Do you want to feel my energy?" I said sure, and she then placed her hand a few inches from my face. The amount of energy or whatever it was that came from her hand caused my entire skull to vibrate and made me extremely dizzy. I have no idea what that could have been. I have never seen her again to this day, but I often think about it. I'm 23 now. I tried researching Asian myths and legends, trying to discover some kind of spirit or demon common to a specific culture that resembles her. Could anyone tell me what this apparition was, or if she was just a crazy woman with psychic abilities? When I was young, I lived in a small, one-story house in a bad community a little ways south of Atlanta, Georgia. My parents bought the house when there were no other houses in the neighborhood, save for one or two neighbors that weren't exactly close enough to really be counted as proper neighbors. Well, by the time that I had come along and gotten old enough to play outside on my own, there were way more houses. It wasn't a huge neighborhood or anything, but it was way more built up than when my parents originally moved there. Behind my house, there were some woods. The woods were pretty dense, and went on for a few miles before there was a middle school and its football field. Sometimes at night, if it was clear, you could see the stadium lights glow way beyond the tree line. Anyways, in these woods I discovered a creek. My parents told me that when they first moved here, there were all sorts of fish and crawdads living in there. But when I first discovered the creek, I found nothing except for maybe a few tiny minnows. Maybe 5 or so spanning a mile, both up the creek from my house and down the creek. As I mentioned earlier, I didn't live in a very good area. The news was always talking about some shooting or drive-by, but where my neighborhood sat, it was usually more tame. This was in the early 2000s, and I didn't have internet or any sort of gaming console, but it was fine because I loved being outside anyways. Even if the mosquitoes were literally the worst, and I have a more severe allergic reaction to their bites. My favorite place to go and hide was out by the creek. But one time I went down, I remember seeing more vultures and scavenging birds flying around and sitting in the trees than normal. But no big deal. It was probably just a dead deer or something. I made my way to the creek and rolled up my jeans to stomp around in the water and kick up mud or whatever I used to do. But before I even finished rolling up my pants legs, I saw something. Still bent over, I was pretty close to a sickly pale, decently fresh-looking, human finger. It startled me for more than one reason, and I shot up like a rocket. There was nothing else around, though. No signs of other people, no blood, no body. Just a finger in the creek behind my house. It bothered me, but I was one of those weird, quiet kids, so it was a few months before I said anything. As it turns out, a few doors down there was a man hiding from the FBI in his sister's house. I never found out if he was an actual killer or anything, but I do remember waking up one night to see SWAT trucks and officers outside. One of the officers knocked on our door to ask my parents a few questions and to check to see if things were all right, and I remembered the finger. Of course, it was months later, so I doubted that it was still there and said nothing. I never heard anything else related to the guy, or the FBI, or the finger. But in my 8, maybe 9-year-old mind, it all seemed connected. And to this day, I'm pretty sure there was a murderer a few doors down from me when I was a kid. I'm not saying we have a ghost, spook, or spirit, but something phenomenological is definitely happening in our home. The brief background on the home is that it's over 70 years old in an older part of our town. The previous resident was a well-respected attorney in the area, and he died here. We wouldn't learn this until after we moved in. The house was almost completely dismantled and rebuilt with new everything. Paint, electric, plumbing, drywall, etc. One floor, not a whole lot of square footage. An attic that has about 2.5 feet of clearance. Not long after getting moved in, my wife and I learned a little bit more about the house's history, and that the previous owner had passed away, and that it was quite some time after his death before he was discovered. We made peace with this information, and continued settling in. The first peculiar incident wasn't really that peculiar. It had been well over a year since the previous owner passed, but he kept receiving mail. A lot of mail. Fun mail, too. Magazines and newspapers with the subscriptions renewing. We remarked on the mail as being merely interesting, and for the sake of creating a tradition, we always kept the old attorney's mail for a day or two, in case he just wanted to read it. Eventually, this would trickle to a stop. The second peculiar incident caught our attention. After 2 months of being in the house, we decided to get newer, better locks for the doors. I had a new key, my wife had a new key. 2 extra keys went on the key hook. A few days go by, and my wife asked me if I had lost my key or if I had trouble locking or unlocking the door. I hadn't. She showed me the 2 extra keys. Both were still on the wire ring, and both had bends of about 15 degrees right at the key shoulder. We agreed that this was odd, but we let it go with some loose rationalizations. The third peculiar incident started a little over 2 years ago, and continues still. Neither I nor my wife smoke. However, about once every 2 weeks on a random day, and usually after midnight, the distinct odor of warm cigarette smoke can be smelled in our living room. At first, we thought it was someone walking nearby, or a neighbor, or an odd or unfortunate combination of smells from a garbage can. We got some cameras, and pointed them outside to see what we could see. Nothing. The last time we smelled cigarettes was about 2 weeks ago. And we've had electricians check our wiring on unrelated matters just in case. The fourth incident relates to the second. 2 metal spoons in the silverware drawer were bent. Almost snapped. Aside from the cigarette smoke, it's been a while since anything has happened, until last week. For whatever reason, the attorney's mail is resumed and the 5th peculiar incident has occurred. I work out in the woods, and my wife now works from home in the company of our 2 cats. In a flurry of texts and phone calls, she told me that it sounded like someone was running around upstairs, as if they were rushing across the house to answer the phone, was how she described it. We've had squirrels in our useless attic and the occasional tree branch. The footsteps exceeded both of those. The 6th and most recent peculiar incident is equal parts mundane and intriguing. We have a favorite spatula. Yes, we do. Some of you reading this probably have your own favorite spatula, spoon, fork, pot, pan as well. We used the bright robin's egg blue utensil to make our Thanksgiving dinner and set it aside with the rest of the cooking detritus. That evening, and the following morning, the kitchen is cleaned and everything is put away. Sunday began the greater holiday baking season, requiring the favorite spatula. Except, it was missing. The ceramic container where the utensils are stored has everything else. Red things, green things, metal things, wooden things. Visual inspection of the surrounding area results in zilch. Every cupboard and drawer opened and investigated to nothing. We sadly conclude that after the big cleanup, it must have ended up in the trash. So we began an online hunt for its replacement. On Friday last, I get a picture of the utensils sitting quite happily amongst all the others. I was confused by this, since the evening before we had to use other tools instead of the missing spatula because it was missing. So, sometime after 9:30 p.m. Thursday and 7:18 a.m. on Friday, something that was missing for at least 5 days returned. So, here it is in order. 1. A confluence of strange coincidences. 2. Sleepwalking. 3. Someone is managing to live in our attic. 4. That I and my wife are in a weirdly mutual prank cycle. Or 5. Something real is happening. If you have any ideas, tests, solutions, resources, or suggestions, I'm listening. Nothing seems malvoyant about what's been happening. but it's definitely happening. From as early as I can remember, I used to fall asleep watching old, reel-to-reel black and white cartoons on my wall, like Steamboat Willie. I clearly remember the jittery, shutter-like quality of the cartoon from the old reel-to-reel projector. There was no actual movie projector in my room. At night, I would wake up to someone tapping me on the shoulder. I had a usual routine that I followed when it happened, which involved burying myself under my covers and telling myself that I would count to 7 and then turn over to see what was there. Not sure if there's a significance to 7. To this day, I like to end things with 7. For example, I set my alarm at 6:27 and not 6:30. But anyhow, I would go through the counting routine multiple times. I wanted to see what was there, but I was a kid and didn't really want to see what was there. My mom would tell me that I just needed to confront it and tell it to leave me alone. It took years to build up that courage. I don't remember exactly how long, but I must have been in my early teens before I actually did get the nerve up to turn over right away and tell it to leave me alone and stop tapping me on the shoulder. Once I confronted it, it did stop. Then comes my baby sister when I was 15. She would wake up screaming in the middle of the night quite often. Once she was old enough to talk, she said that she was scared of the hand that came up between her wall and the bed and tapped her on the shoulder at night. This won't make sense until later in the story, but my brother's room is on the second floor of my house. He has a door that leads up onto the roof, and it's pretty high up, so there's no way to get up there. Anyways, this was when I was around 13 or 14. My twin brother got a Ouija board recently, and me and my friend always used it. One day we decided to play with it like usual, just because we were bored. My brother went into the shower, so it was just me and my friend in my brother's room. We started using the Ouija board, and nothing really happened. It starts moving, and I usually move it or he does, because we were dumb kids. This time, I wasn't moving it, so I just assumed that it was him. For 5 minutes, nothing happened, but we started asking the spirit to do something to let us know that we were there. This is when it got weird. Outside the door in my brother's room, the one that leads to the roof, me and my friend started hearing humming and singing sounds. We got pretty scared and kept asking questions to the Ouija board. After that, there was a subtle banging or tapping kind of noise. One of the drawers in the dresser behind us opened. We said goodbye and put it away. Haven't used it since. There's a ghost inside of mine and my girlfriend's new home. We've heard stomping in the kitchen in the middle of the night, among lots of other things. The issue that I have is that I wonder why it never shows itself or does anything in my presence. I've come home to doors open, and the animals in the corner shaking. Or I'll hear things in the other room falling, and sure enough, there will be something on the floor, but it never does anything while I'm in the room. My girlfriend, however, has seen the ghost, has had it open doors that she was next to, and heard it whisper. Is my energy off-putting to the ghost, or does my girlfriend attract it through her fear? I do not fear the ghost, and view it as more of an annoyance than anything, whereas she is terrified of it. So it was around May of this year when I was playing hide and seek with my family. When the game started, I went to the basement. But after a couple minutes I was about to be spotted, so I moved to the bathroom, but went backwards into the bathroom. Keep in mind I was facing the doorway, and that is when it started. When I heard the groans, I froze. They didn't sound human, so I knew it wasn't one of my family members. A couple of minutes went by, and I could still hear the groans, but built up the courage to run out of the bathroom. A couple of more minutes went by. I could still hear the groans, and I had to build up the courage to run from the bathroom. That's all I have to share. If you could explain what happened, then that would be great. My great-grandmother died in that house. It was built in the 1940s, and that basement bathroom was built very poorly.